Ivy. I never spoke to my landlord. And in all my years as his tenant I saw him, or had a glimpse of him, only once. There was another glimpse, but that was even briefer, was from a distance, and was of his back. The true glimpse came on the public road one afternoon, at the end of my walk, and I was so little prepared for it, and it was so brief, that I couldn't say afterwards what my landlord looked like. That day I hadn't done the walk up the Lark Hills to the Barrows and the closer view of Stonehenge. I had done the other, shorter walk, on flatter ground. At the farmyard at the bottom of the hill I had turned down the wide straight stretch of the droveway, bisected for some time now by the barbed wire fence. It was there, down the free part of the wide way, that I had seen Jack driving back early one Sunday afternoon after his midday drinking at the pub, bumping and banging along in his old car, plowing through the tussocky grass like a launch in choppy water. And it was along that way that on the Christmas Saturday before he died he had driven his car twice, once out, once back, to have his last evening with his friends in the pub. On the barbed wire fence there were still the shredded remains of one or two of the plastic sack paddings Jack's father-in-law had rolled at his crossing places. And at intervals down that way there were the older relics Jack would have known. On one side, the empty, abandoned gray beehive set down in the grass in two crooked rows. On the other side, in the shade of bush and silver birch, the abandoned gypsy caravan with its cambered roof and variegated colors, the caravan itself still appearing in working order. Further on that same side, past the young wood, there was the old hayrick shaped like a cottage and covered with the black plastic sheeting that had over the years grown ragged at the edges, had lost its shine and its ability to crackle, and had thinned and weathered to a texture like that of a faded rose petal or the skin of a very old person. Beyond that, the mysterious house ruin, all walls, with a boundary line of sycamores that had grown tall, those regularly spaced sycamores now like part of the mystery of the place. When they were planted, and for many years afterwards, the seedlings or saplings would have seemed far apart, and would have made no impression in the wide way. Now the crowns of foliage on the sturdy trunks met, and cast a solid cold shade in which even in the hottest summer no grass could grow. The earth, though flinty, was always damp and black around that ruin, like ground trodden on by sheep. The straight stretch of the droveway ended in an abrupt bare slope marked with lines and welts and indentations that suggested old agriculture or old fortifications. The way itself curved to run beside this slope, which, though not high, shut out a further view and led the eye up to the sky. Nothing now on that striated antique hillside, hardly pasture. Only a water trough, no grass around it, the flinty soil trampled into black mud. From time to time steers, on the upper slope outlined against the old sky, were penned there, blank, healthy, heavy-bellied, responsive to every human approach, waiting now only for the covered trailer and the trip along the winding valley road to the slaughterhouse in the town. On the other side of the way there was a wide tilled field that led gently up to a wood. The tilling of such flinty soil, and the flints could be big and heavy, was new. I had been told that it had started only during the war, when the discovery was made that, in addition, of course, to fertilizer, ground like that needed to be merely scratched rather than deeply plowed. In the wood at the top were reared pheasants for shooting, pheasants which, when grown, wandered all over the valley. It was in that wood that I had gone walking during my very first week in the valley, and, in a muddy lane overhung with trees I had later learned to be blackthorn, I had met Jack's father-in-law. The droveway here was deeply rutted, tall grass growing in tufts on the ridges, the ruts themselves narrow and bare and flinty, with loose gravel. Hard to walk on, ankle-turning. On this path one day, during my first or second year, when hares still delighted me, and I looked for them during every walk, I had seen the dusty, ragged, half-rotted away carcass of a hare. The area was famous for its hares. A traveler in the previous century, William Cobbett, had once seen, not far away from here, a field full of hares. And there were still hare shoots, curiously feudal occasions in one way, with hired beaters driving the animals over the downs towards the shooters, hidden behind bales of hay on the droveway, and at the same time occasions on which landowners and laborers and men from the small towns round about were at one, united by old country instincts. Perhaps the hare had been shot during one of those shoots. Perhaps the wounded animal had been mangled and dragged out to the droveway by a dog. Dead and soon useless, soon less than carrion, it had perhaps been turned over inquisitively by a farm worker or a walker, kicked or pushed along a deep rut and left finally to dry and molder away. What mighty hind legs! Folded in death. Such a skeleton, or something that reminded me of it, I saw again more than 10 years later on a high rocky islet midway in the narrow channel between southwestern Trinidad and Venezuela. This was an islet of pelicans and frigate birds, but pelicans above all. Here pelicans lived and also died. In the central dips of the islet the ground was springy with guano, and on the rock ledges there were whole pelican skeletons, as though, knowing themselves to be in their sanctuary, the big birds had folded their powerful wings and settled down to die. The pelican bones on that islet, called by the Spaniards soldado, the soldier, and afterwards by the English soldiers rock, looked like the strong hind legs, bones within dusty fur, of that hare. The antique, bare slope at one side of the droveway receded and became high and steep, so that there was something like a field or paddock on that side of the droveway. There was a pond in this field, and at various points down the high, steep slope trees had been planted. The inexplicable little pond, the abruptness and height of the slope, the scattered trees, the land here had a feeling of oddity, ancientness, even sanctity. The elms in the paddock or field at the foot of the steep slope had all been cut down, like the elms all over the valley, and showed now only as level stumps sawn off about a foot or so above the ground. There were 1 or 2 horses in the paddock. Unbridled, broad-backed, with muzzles perhaps a little too sloping, they looked heavy, primitive animals, and as emblematic as everything else in that setting, the pond, the paddock, the elm stumps, the steep green slope with the scattered trees, each tree casting a perfect shadow. As though, as in a primitive painting, every element here had to be perfectly realized, separately realized. In the very simplicity and clarity of the view there was a kind of mystery. It linked either to the bare downs to which it led in one direction, nor to the lush river vegetation, the water meadows, to which it led in the other direction. The rutted droveway, running past little houses and gardens, one of them the old farm manager's house, with its full, many-colored suburban English garden, became paved and then, very quickly losing mystery, met the public road. This road ran on a ledge or cutting in the down just above the river. It was the road Jack, after his drinking that Sunday lunchtime, had decided not to take. There was a steep drop down to the river. To the right there was a weir. And beyond, water meadows that were like the water meadows Constable had painted 150 years before. After antiquity, Constable, and also the more recent past. It was of Augustus John that I had first thought, very vaguely, when I had seen the gypsy caravan across the droveway from Jack's cottage and the old farm buildings. Then, after I had got to know the book, the caravan brought to mind, at the same time as it gave a reality to, the drawings and colored illustrations by E.H. Shepard for The Wind in the Willows. That book itself, about a river like the one I now saw, still seemed new, contemporary. And the paint on the caravan, which appeared to be in such good order and seemed to have been temporarily parked, was still so bright that it was easy to imagine that the caravan might be on the road again one day, and that just around the corner on the droveway, by the silver birches, say, one might come upon the old world, in which that caravan once had a real place, going on. Just in this way now the water meadows had the effect, in one corner of the mind, of abolishing the distance between Constable and the present. The painter, the man with his colors and brushes and boards, seemed as near and contemporary as what he made us now see, the water channels and pollard willows he had settled down one day to paint. This idea of the painter, this glimpse of the painter's view, made the past ordinary. The past was like something one could stretch out and reach. It was like something physically before one, like something one could walk in. Shepard and Constable, they had imposed their vision on an old landscape. But on their vision was imposed something else now, a modern picturesque. Beeches as old as the century lined the narrow road. Hundreds, thousands, of young beeches grew on the leaf-strewn slope between the main row of beeches at the edge of the down and the asphalted road, and thousands more on the steeper slope from the road down to the river. All the shades of delicate light-shot green, of overlapping, transparent green leaves, hung over the road. This was the scenic drive the taxi drivers of the town took visitors along. The beeches had been planted at the turn of the century by the father of my landlord and were now like a natural, wasting monument of the father's grandeur. This grandeur had come from the consolidation and extension in imperial times of a family fortune established earlier, during the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The family had its roots elsewhere. Many branches of the family now flourished elsewhere. But my landlord lived on here, where once his family had owned nearly all the land and many of the houses, in a few acres beside the river. And it was here, on this road, at the end of my walk below the trees planted by his father before he, the son, had been born, that I had my first and only true glimpse of my landlord. It was a confused glimpse. The road was narrow, curving. I was nervous of the car, as I was nervous of all cars or vehicles on this stretch of road with its blind curves. Then, rather late, I saw that it was the Manor car. Then I thought to look for Mr. Phillips, and to acknowledge him. Mr. Phillips was smiling. It was a friendly, happy smile, and it was odd in a man whose manner and instincts were authoritarian and protective, and whose usual expression in public was one of sternness and irritability. The smile, then, the conviviality and relaxedness of it, told me that the occasion was special and his passenger was special. And I knew at once, I had an immediate idea, that the person sitting beside Mr. Phillips was my landlord, the man in the manor, the man I had got used to not seeing. And before, forgetting Mr. Phillips's smile and the dangers of the road, I could properly focus on the stranger, the car had gone. This was my only glimpse of my landlord, his face, and I wasn't sure what I had seen. I had an impression of a round face, a bald head, a suit, or the jacket of a brown suit, a benign expression. What I most clearly remembered, it was the detail I was sure of, not the kind of detail that imagination could supply, was a low, slow wave of a hand. A wave just above the dashboard, so that from the road I saw the tips of his fingers making an arc at the bottom of the windshield. We had never met. Mr. Phillips must have told him who I was, and, in spite of the bad sight he was said to have, one of his many afflictions, he must have seen me before I had seen him. And secure in the car, with Mr. Phillips at his side, he must have seen me more clearly than I had seen him. My glimpse had been so hurried, so shot through with the confusion of the moment, coming at the end of a swift sequence of little alarms and recognitions, that I wasn't sure whether my imagination, as instantaneously as in a dream, hadn't suggested certain of the details I thought I had seen, to supply me with a picture of the man I had more or less created in my head already. I had an impression of benignity above the wave. But I had cause to question that impression when I spoke to Mr. Phillips on the telephone in the evening. With a laugh that was like a carryover from the smiling good humor I had seen in him in the car that afternoon, he said yes, the man I had seen in the car was my landlord. And then, as though explaining my doubt, Mr. Phillips said, "He always wears dark glasses in the car. Otherwise his stomach gets upset, and then he gets a migraine." How then, if he had been wearing dark glasses, had I seen a benign expression in his eyes? So this glimpse of my landlord, this glimpse of someone unexpectedly ordinary, made him, after all, more mysterious. And more than the man, it was the occasion that was memorable. The manor car with the descendant of the manor builder and the planter of the trees, driving below the beeches on the ledge at the rim of the down, just above the river and the water meadows. So that more than ever for me the personality of the man continued to be expressed by his setting, by these beeches on the public road, by the permanently closed front gate of the manor, and the overgrown garden at the back. My imagination had given me a glimpse of a benign elderly man in a brown jacket making a shy wave from his car. This picture, created in a flash as the car had gone by, answered my own need. It was how I wished to think of the man in whose grounds I had so unexpectedly, for the first time in my adult life, found myself at peace. I soon learned that the picture wasn't true. Neither was the other picture which I carried, a contrary, slightly sinister picture I had allowed my fantasy to work up from details given then and at other times by Mr. Phillips, of a fat, round-faced man buttoned up in a suit, with dark glasses and a hat, being taken out for a spin through countryside he would never otherwise see. being taken out for thrilling but safe glimpses, safe as for a child standing behind a rail at the top of a tower and looking down, of the world from which he had withdrawn, yet never too thrilling, not London, for instance, just the countryside, and the houses of a few people he knew very well, and some hotels on the south coast, where he went in fine weather to have lunch or to get his hair cut. This last detail, given me quite innocently by Mr. Phillips one day, added long, lank hair to the dark-glassed and otherwise formally suited recluse of my fantasy. I saw my landlord being at once pushed and supported into the lobby of some Victorian hotel by Mr. Phillips holding on with both hands to the left arm of his charge, while the free right hand of my landlord blindly groped. Neither picture, either the man I thought I had seen, nor the man I had invented, answered to what I was told about my landlord by people in London who knew him and sometimes came to visit him. That other man, coming to me in fragments as it were, remained far away. A pampered childhood here, in the grounds where I now walked about. In the cold shade of the overgrown orchard there was a round, 2-story children's house, solidly built, thatched, and still more or less whole, though the surrounding vegetation was partly strangled and decayed, as in true forest. In the room downstairs there was a real fireplace, with inset stone or concrete shelves in the wall on either side, and with ladder steps to the upper room, which had dormer windows in the conical thatched roof. More than a doll's house on a grand scale, and yet less than a child's playhouse, an adult's idea, rather, of a children's house, with nothing left to the imagination. After that pampered, protected childhood, a young manhood of artistic talent and promise and of social frivolity. I was shown photographs of those days both by Mr. Phillips and by Bray, the car hire man, whose father had worked all his life at the manor. Bray lived in the flint and brick cottage his father had bought long ago from the estate, but though Bray was now independent of the manor and proud of it, refusing even to serve people in the manor, he had all kinds of manor souvenirs to show and he liked showing them. Blurred black and white photographs of parties in the grounds, the gardens not yet grown, undergrown, photographs of young people sitting in uncertain light, dusk or dawn, on the rails of new timber bridges over the creeks in the water meadows. Photographs, snapshots, melancholy in their effect, each snapshot capturing a moment of time, with all its unconsidered details, forcing one to think of the tract of time that had followed, and being a kind of memento mori in the way a good painting of the same occasion, charged with the spirit and labor of the painter, would never have been. Then in early middle age, after the parties, after the Second War, a disturbance of some sort, a morbid, lasting depression, almost an illness, resulting in withdrawal, hiding, a retreat to the manor, complicated after a while by physical disorders and, finally, age. I was his opposite in every way, social, artistic, sexual. And considering that his family's fortune had grown, but enormously, with the spread of the empire in the 19th century, it might be said that an empire lay between us. This empire at the same time linked us. This empire explained my birth in the New World, the language I used, the vocation and ambition I had. This empire in the end explained my presence there in the valley, in the cottage, in the grounds of the manor. But we were, or had started, at opposite ends of wealth, privilege, and in the hearts of different cultures. 20 years before, when I was trying to write at the Earl's Court boarding house, residence in the grounds of the manor would have seemed suitable material. But the imperial link would then have been burdensome. It would have tormented me as a man, or boy, to be a racial oddity in the valley, and I would have been able as a writer, at that time, to deal with the material only by suppressing certain aspects of myself, the very kind of suppression and concealment that narrative of a certain sort encouraged and which had led me, even as an observer, eager for knowledge and experience, to miss much. But the world had changed, time had moved on. I had found my talent and my subject, ever unfolding and developing. My career had changed, my ideas had changed. And coming to the manor at a time of disappointment and wounding, I felt an immense sympathy for my landlord, who, starting at the other end of the world, now wished to hide, like me. I felt a kinship with him, was deeply grateful for the protection of the manor, for the style of things there. I never thought his seclusion strange. It was what I wanted for myself at that time. I wanted, when I came to the manor, after the pride of ambition, to strip my life down. I wanted to live as far as possible with what I found in the cottage in the manor grounds, to alter as little as possible. I wanted to avoid vanity, and for me then vanity could lie in very small things, like wishing to buy an ashtray. Why a special ashtray, when the empty tobacco tin could serve? So I felt in tune with what I saw or thought I saw at the manor. I felt in myself the same spirit of withdrawal. And though I knew that men might arrive at similar states or attitudes for dissimilar reasons and by different routes, and as men might even be incompatible, I felt at one with my landlord. Privilege lay between us. But I had an intimation that it worked against him. Whatever my spiritual state at the moment of arrival, I knew I would have to save myself and look for health. I knew I would have to act at some time. His privilege, his house, his staff, his income, the acres he could look out at every day and knew to be his, this privilege could press him down into himself, into non-doing and nullity. So though we had started at opposite ends of empire and privilege, and in different cultures, it was easy for me, as his tenant now, to feel goodwill in my heart for him. I never thought it odd or creepy, to use the word given me by Allen, a literary visitor, that I never saw my landlord. His wish to be unseen by me was matched by my wish not to be seen by him. A remnant of my old colonial racial nerves, but I was also nervous of undoing the magic of the place. If I had seen my landlord, heard his voice, heard his conversation, seen his face and expression, been constrained to make conversation back, to be polite, the impression would have been ineffaceable. He would have been endowed with a character, with vanities, irritations, absurdities, and this would have led me to make judgments, the judgments that, undoing acceptance, can also undo a relationship. As it was, the personality of my landlord was expressed for me by the mystery of the manor and the grounds. The manor grounds grew on me. And used to the seasons, in the way I have described, and so far as architecture went, still perhaps tending to take things too much for granted, seeing ordinary buildings too much as natural expressions of a particular place, it took me time to understand what I was seeing. It took me time to see that my cottage, in spite of its name, was not a simple building. It was a long, low building on 2 levels. There was a slight, graded slope from the road to the water meadows and the river. It was at the far side of the lawn or manor. Green. Whatever my mood, and however long or short my separation from the cottage, whether I had gone on an overseas assignment of many months or had simply gone to Salisbury or had gone for my afternoon walk, the first sight of the cottage on my return, breaking in upon me at the end of the short, dark lane from the public road, never failed to delight and surprise me. The lane from the public road was overhung with yew, and summer added the layer upon layer shade of beech and copper beech, so that even while I was in that gloom, the openness of the lawn and the soft warm colors of the cottage were visible. I felt delight at the long, low shape of the building set right against the beeches. The roots of 1 or 2 beeches began just beyond the cottage wall, and yet, for some reason, there was never any shifting or subsidence of the cottage foundations. I felt delight at the setting, the naturalness, the rightness. And surprised that this was where I lived. It took me time to understand that this was no country. Naturalness. That the cottage had been designed to create just that effect. The walls were thick, perhaps rubble-filled, but on the surface they were a considered mixture of flint and brickbats and warm yellow stone. And once I saw the design and the intention, I also saw that the masonry was craftsman's work. One day, on a block of stone set high up on a side wall, I saw the carved initials of the builder or designer. The last initial proclaimed him a member of my landlord's family, with the year 1911. Play from someone of the family, in that secure, far-off year, the coronation year of the King Emperor, George V. With my instinct to accept what I found, it took me time to recognize the element of play, and the extent of it, in the ordering of the manor grounds. A short yew hedge separated my cottage from a small, single-roomed wooden building, unpainted, and now weathered gray-black. This building, square in plan and taller than my cottage, was extravagantly rustic in style. The walls were of thick, rough-sawn planks. The lower edge of the planks kept this shape and the bark of the trunk from which they had been sawn. The whole structure rested on mushroom-shaped stones. I thought that this fanciful house or shed was intended by the builder. Whether it was the same member of the family who had built my cottage I didn't know, to be the forester's hut in the play settlement, or village around the lawn or manor green. Until one summer afternoon, in my 3rd or 4th year, Pittun, the gardener, coming back after lunch in a relaxed mood, opened the weathered door to show me. And how easily and sturdily that door swung open, though the building had not been used for years. What I had thought of as the forester's hut was no such thing. It had been a stable. It even had a hay loft. There was still hay in the loft, and there were still ropes and harness hanging on nails, and leather and trappings connected with horses, and still a smell of horse, and a timber floor quite clean below the cobwebs. Everything was weathered outside. Inside, and the wooden house or box was much taller and bigger than it seemed from the outside, everything was protected, in spite of the starlings that besieged it at certain times and especially for 2 or 3 weeks in the spring. A stable like a forester's hut, I allowed my fantasy to persist, and across the lawn a squash court built to look like a farmhouse, its apparently rough walls as carefully thought out as the walls of my own cottage. Next to that were the rough-timbered garages or wagon sheds. And then the antique, ivy-covered, flint-walled storehouse or granary whose back formed part of the churchyard wall. So that after the spaciousness of the downs and the water meadows, the country openness, there was suddenly here a remnant and a reminder of medieval huddle and constriction. And just as, along the driveway, the modernity of the old farm manager's bungalow was set next to the antiquity of the worn, striated slopes, so here the modern fantasy of my cottage and the forester's hut and the farmhouse was set next to, ran into, the Middle Ages. And yet it made a whole. It worked. You could take it all for granted, as I had done at the beginning, and see it as something that went with an Edwardian big house in this part of the country. Or you could enter the fantasy, a child's vision made concrete, child's play by an adult or adults, extraordinary, this gratuitous expression of great security and wealth in this corner of an estate that once was so much bigger, and far from places like Trinidad, where the word estate, when I first got to know it, especially if it was a sugar estate, didn't hold any idea of grandeur or style, carrying connotations instead only of size and sameness, and many small lives and small houses at the edges. And yet it was this element of play, the child's play of the toy settlement around the manor green or lawn, which, when I recognized it, I yielded to. Across the lane, from the forester's hut, and visible from the side window of my cottage, was what looked like a little country cottage on its own. It was really a shed built against the wall of the manor's vegetable garden, but it had been designed like a half cottage, a cottage sliced down through the middle from the ridge of the roof, to suggest, from certain angles, a cottage with a door and a window. The lane that ran around the settlement, and its green was lined with mushroom-shaped stones. These stones, I was told, were a local feature. Barns used to be built on them to keep the rats out. They had kept the rats out of the stable, the forester's hut. But it was their decorative, fairy tale quality that was exploited here. Every mushroom stone had been made to look different from every other. The tops were chipped differently, and sometimes the supports were carved into a curve. Over the years many of these mushrooms had been damaged. They were too delicate a fantasy. Many of the mushroom tops had in fact disappeared, been got out of the way, and even some of the supporting stones had been knocked flat. But by a miracle, outside my cottage door, on the lane side, in front of the wall of the vegetable garden, there had been preserved 5 or 6 of these mushrooms as they had been originally designed, the tops chipped into different degrees of thickness, chipped rough, each mushroom top supporting a little moss forest in winter. This was the fantasy to which I returned, the many-featured fantasy of manor village around its green, manor garden, and always felt welcomed by, in that first winter, while I was working on my book. It was the fantasy of the original builder or builders, the family fantasy which my landlord had inherited and which now, I felt, as I entered more and more into it, best expressed his character. The rest of the grounds, the orchard, the garden at the back of the main house, the water meadows, the walk along the river, all of that came later, in the late spring or early summer, when I was ill and couldn't do the long walks along the droveway. This was the time I learned to fix that particular season, to give it certain associations of flowers, trees, river. After I had finished my book, the one with the African centerpiece, I had gone abroad to do some journalism, for the money, the travel out of England, and the spiritual refreshment. The assignments had been exhausting, the second in a place not served by many airlines. I had fallen ill on the slow journey back, through many climates, and in one place had spent 4 days and nights in a hotel room, in a stupor of ache and sleep. I was light-headed when I returned to the valley and the cottage. I felt its welcoming quality, its protectiveness, and was moved by the unearthly beauty, as it seemed to me, of every growing thing around my cottage. The peonies below the sitting-room windows made an especial impression. My fantasies, both waking and sleeping, constantly played with the shapes of these developing, tight, round, dark red buds. The doctor found nothing seriously wrong with me, no infection of lung or blood. He said I was tired. He said, and we were in a military area. Battle fatigue. And as the weeks passed, that indeed was what my illness seemed to resolve itself into, a great tiredness, not unpleasant, a tiredness with the little delirium that, alas, too rarely, had come to me as a child with a tropical fever. This fever associated with the chill of the rainy season, the season of extravagant, dramatic weather, of interruptions in routine, of days off from school because of rain and floods, and the coughs and fevers to which they gave rise. How often, as a child, having had my fever, I had longed to have it all over again, to experience all the distortions of perceptions it brought about, the extraordinary sense of smoothness, not only to one's touch, but also in one's mouth and stomach, and with that, voices and noises becoming oddly remote and exciting. I had never had fever as often as I would have liked. Instead, very soon, as I had grown up, fever had been replaced by the real misery of bronchitis and asthma, exhausting afflictions without a good side. Now, in my welcoming cottage, deliciously, for the first time since my childhood, I felt I was having fever. Exhaustion, work, travel, had brought it on. The doctor's diagnosis felt true. In my welcoming cottage, hidden by layer upon layer of beech and yew from the public road, I began to feel oppressed by the labors and strains of the last 20 years. The strains connected with writing, that passion. The personal strains as well that had begun that day when the Pan American World Airways plane had taken me up and shown me that pattern of the fields I had been surrounded by as a child in Trinidad but had never seen till that moment. All the work, all the strain, all the disappointments and recoveries, now seemed to sit in a solid mass in my head. But I had no vision now of being a corpse at the bottom of a river, no dream of an exploding head that left me shaken up, exhausted, after a struggle to wake. All the stress had turned to fever. So that in my welcoming cottage I was like a child again. As though I had at last, after 20 years, traveled to the equivalent of the fantasy I had had in mind when I left home. And it was in this mood that when I recovered sufficiently to go outside, I began, with the encouragement of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, who asked me to dismiss the idea that I might be trespassing on my landlord's privacy, to explore the spring of the overgrown garden. The spring that had begun for me, and had been fixed for me, by the peony pushing up tight, swelling buds on rhubarb-like stalks below the sitting-room window of my cottage. In my 20 years off and on in England I must have seen many thousands of peonies. They were a common flower, as I was to see when I was fit enough to take bus rides into Salisbury. Right through the valley, in open, sun-struck gardens, small and large, country cottage or suburban-style gardens, I saw them blooming away too fast in bright light, losing their tightness and deep color, rapidly losing their virtue. None of the many thousands I had seen before this spring had made an impression on me. I had never been able to put the name, peony, to any of them. I had never been able to attach them to a season or a time of year or to the appearance of other flowers or to other natural events. These peonies of my convalescence, these peonies around my cottage, were my first, and they stood for my new life. The clump outside the sitting-room window was on the north of the cottage. There was another clump, in the shade of the yew hedge between my cottage and the forester's hut. They came out slowly, preserving their shape, developing an especially deep color. From the lane below the yews and the beeches, the peonies of my cottage made two deep points of color in an otherwise green expanse, edged with wilderness. Once there were 16 gardeners. Now there was only Pitun. He grew vegetables in the walled garden. There he also grew certain flowers for the manor and my landlord. He looked after a private lawn of my landlord's somewhere else in the grounds. He was like Jack, marking out and maintaining areas of cultivation in the midst of wasteland. But much of what Pitun did was hidden from me. What I saw was mainly wilderness, through which once or twice in the season Pitun would cut, for him and me, the narrowest of paths, quite literally. One swath up, one swath down. This two-swathed path of Pitun's began at the end of the lawn, almost opposite the shaded lane that led from the public road. The path ran through an enclosure hedged with old box, unpruned, grown out now almost into trees, meeting above the entrance to make an arch, almost as if that had been intended. The enclosure was empty, without any sign of old planting or old flower beds. In one corner a sycamore had been planted or had seated itself. There were a number of sycamores about, growing apparently at random, and on this sycamore, a tree now rather than a sapling, someone had trailed a wisteria vine, itself now an old thing, speaking of the old days and the many gardeners and of people having the time and means and wish to embellish a hidden corner. In the winter the enclosure had been full of the dried-up stalks of weeds, sometimes as tall as dried maize plants, and clumps of thin, long-bladed grass. Now the weeds, on succulent, thick, green stalks were growing tall again. But in spite of those weeds and the wild grass, the path Pitun had cut, one swath up, one swath down, showed grass as tight and fine and level as the grass of a lawn, as though the wilderness was only on the surface and awaited only this cut to reveal the old order and beauty and many seasons tending that lay beneath. This enclosure seemed to be part of the garden of the manor. But I was told by Bray, the car hire man, that it was older, and the overgrown box hedge suggested a greater age. The enclosure belonged to the house that was here before the manor, Bray said, and he said that before that, there had been a monastery or nunnery on the site. The idea was not a fantastic one. In medieval times everything would have lain along the little river. Just a few miles away, at Amesbury, where the river went wide and shallow and clear, there was an abbey and perhaps also the remnant of the nunnery to which Guinevere came from Winchester Camelot when the Round Table of King Arthur broke up. An enclosure, then, as stripped of human presence as that damp stone ruin on the driveway, the stone ruin surrounded by sycamores that, ignoring the decay and death of the house they were intended to shelter, continued to grow, casting a cold shade on the black, grassless earth. As stripped as that far-off ruin, this emptiness within the tall box hedge, just a few steps from my cottage, where, if Bray was right, religious men or women of another age, renouncers of the world perhaps, pampered people, possibly also half-prisoners, had taken the air or told their beads, secluded in the medieval huddle of a village, between the village center of church and churchyard and the busy river and wet fields, water meadows, busy with peasant labor turning over the heavy, rich black earth. At the end of this enclosure was the orchard. Old, even decayed, it stood among older forest trees, and the box hedge here was straggly. At the exit the top branches did not meet to form an arch. From here, until the summer green hid it, the river and the willows could be seen across the water meadows, not cropped now, the meadows, no hay taken off them, never busy, and closed even to cattle. No question of taking a shortcut across the water meadows to the river. The land was permanently drowned, cut up by choked channels, and with the remnants, like minor Roman engineering ruins, of abandoned control hatches. It was said that the secrets of drowning and draining the meadows were now lost, labors once as matter-of-fact and seasonal as, say, the water bailiff's cleaning of the river and cutting of the overlong river weeds, floating entanglingly up. Once the wealth of the valleys lay in the wet meadows. Now it lay more in the wide, unencumbered uplands. All that grew now in the manor meadows beyond the orchard, and were never cropped, were the wild yellow irises. One side of the orchard, as you came into it from the enclosure, was like a wood. There were many tall old forest trees and the ground was choked with weeds and tree debris. Suitably, this wood was where the two-story thatched children's house was. I couldn't get to it in the spring. There was no path. Pitun cut a path here much later, and then it was a four-swathed path, first for the hand barrow with garden refuse, and then for the big caged barrow or trolley. Pitun used to ferry dead leaves to the grass and leaf and flower graveyard he had established, out of everybody's sight, at the back of the children's house. This vegetable graveyard or rubbish dump Pitun described as a garden refuge, and a certain amount of ingenuity went into finding or creating these hidden but accessible refuges. That was how Pitun used the word. I believe he had 2 or 3 such refuges at different places. Refuse, refuge, 2 separate, unrelated words. But refuge, which Pitun used for refuse, did in the most remarkable way contain both words. Pitun's refuge not only stood for refuse, but had the additional idea or association, not at all inappropriate, of asylum, sanctuary, hiding, almost of hide-and-seek, of things kept decently out of sight and mind. He might say, of a fallen beech branch on the lawn, or a heap of grass clippings. That'll be going to the refuge. Or, I'll take it down to the refuge presently. I thought at first that it was only Pitton's way with the word. But then I discovered that it was more or less common usage in the valley. I heard it from Bray, the car hire man, Pitton's neighbor. I heard it from him at the time the council workers went on strike for a week or so, or, as little printed notices pinned to trees and bus stops up and down the valley said, the council workers had decided to take industrial action. No refuge this week, Bray said, meaning that there was to be no refuse collection. You don't have to tell me who's behind this. It's the commonest among them, commonest in name and in deed. I also heard the word from Mr. Phillips's father. After the death of his wife, the old man sometimes came on a Saturday afternoon to visit, and also, Saturday being Pitton's day off, to walk through the grounds. He stopped sometimes in front of my cottage to talk. He had started life as a carrier's boy, and he was full of information about the old days. He told me why laborers' cottages beside the public road could be so very narrow. The old coach and cart roads had to be wide. When they were paved they became narrower, and there were strips of ground on either side which for a time were nobody's property. Laborers squatted on these strips and built their cottages. He told me why so many had elder hedges, and why the hedges could be so mounded up and high. Elder grew fast, and a hedge was a squatter's way of staking out his claim. The hedges were high, not with the vegetable growth of centuries, as I had imagined, but with the imperishable household rubbish of the last century. Many of the hedge mounds had been built up with bottles and metal junk and old shoes, rubbish that couldn't be got rid of. And the old man explained, there was no refuge in those days, you see. And I heard the word again from the neat, well-dressed, and anxious man who came to deal with a plague of mice that scuttled about the ceiling of my bedroom, sounding at times as though they were pushing or rolling little pebbles back and forth. This man told me all he knew about rats and mice. Rats were terrors, but they were creatures of habit. They had their runs and could be caught. Mice, on the other hand, could live in small cracks or cavities in the wall. They never pined for light or a freer life. They could live on a gram of food a day, a crumb of biscuit. But the man's heart wasn't in the mouse hell or purgatory or mouse nullity he was describing. Once he might have spoken the words with relish and enjoyed the response of his listener. Now he, the mouse expert, spoke by rote. He was worried about his health. He had had a heart attack quite suddenly one day when he was laying down some poison for some mice. He was worried, above all, about his job, worried that the government or the local authority might close down his little department altogether and put the mice and vermin business out to contract with a private firm. Suddenly, with an accusing stab of the finger, he said, with a use of the word that was as two-edged and apt for him as Pitton's, refuge, was for Pitton. Do you know the next thing to go? The next thing to go will be refuge. Soon there'll be no public refuge in this place. To one side, then, as you came out into the orchard, were the children's house and Pitton's refuge, as yet unreachable by a path, since that had not been cut. To the other side lay the great manor gardens, filling first the space between the water meadows and the vegetable garden and then the space between the water meadows and the manor. Nestlings cheeped in the knotholes in the old orchard trees. Last year's nutshells, the work of gray squirrels, were crunchy on the nut walk that linked the orchard and the big manor lawn. The nut walk ran beside the vegetable garden. The slender boughs of the nut trees had been bent with old skill, or at least before Pitten's time, to meet above. Still visible among the fast-growing nettles and wild rose growth was the stone path around the old rose beds. Then came the lawn proper. And here, fearful of intruding, in spite of what the Phillipses said, I walked at the very edge, beside the water meadow. The water meadow or marsh had already clearly claimed part of what had once been cultivated garden. Certain decorative trees, pink hawthorns especially, now grew in the marsh and were surrounded by marsh debris and vegetation. Many of the marsh plants, and especially the reeds, which might have been planted at one time for the beauty, like Chinese or Japanese calligraphy, of their spear-like leaves, many of these plants had jumped the path Pitten had tried to keep clear at the edge of the wet meadow, and seated themselves in the lawn, like the trash from a sugarcane fire jumping a firebreak and sending arrows of flame into the adjoining green field. The lawn sloped gently up all the way to the house. In the middle there was a big evergreen tree that must have been older than the house. The quarters and little terrace of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, with washing on the terrace, were at one side, behind some statuary. The house was not old. It had been built early in the century, but built to look old. Like the reconstructed church across the lawn from my cottage, it was part of the taste of the time for a special idea of the past, the assertion, with the wealth and power of an unbelievably extensive empire, of racial and historical and cultural virtue. The back of the house made a gray impression, gray stone mottled and mildewed. I never looked very hard at the back facade. There was my wish not to intrude. And there was another reason. I didn't know the internal arrangements, and didn't know from which window my landlord, with his limitless time, his long, empty days, might be looking out. He would have looked out on something like perfection, the lawn with the great tree in the foreground, the forest or wood to one side, the beaten-down water meadow beyond this lawn, with all the growth of willow and reeds and bamboo clumps and dogwood and the shrubs that loved water, the river with its river growths, the water meadows beyond, the willows, the channels, the drowned fields catching the morning light and, at a sufficient distance, the evening light, and then the bare downs again. And what effects of moonlight on these water meadows, with the moon rising above the bare downs! What effect, on a moonlight night, of river and mist! There were only a few acres, relatively speaking, attached to the manor now. The land just beyond the river belonged to another landowner. But by a series of accidents, the water meadows no longer needed for pasture, the shrinking of the small valley villages with the mechanization of agriculture at the end of the last century, the disappearance of many agricultural cottages, the taking over by the military of the distant bare downs. By these and other accidents, the view from the back of the manor, the view through which I walked, was of a nature almost unchanged since Constable's day, a view without a house, without the peasant or river activity of the Middle Ages or the age before the ploughing of the downs, a view almost of a nature park. And all this just a few miles from the famous old towns of Salisbury and Wilton, the modern urban clusters of Southampton and Andover, the red brick, old and new, of the Victorian railway town of Basingstoke, and the Victorian Gothic black brick ring around the cathedral heart of ancient Winchester. The toy village of which my cottage formed part was only an aspect, together with the children's thatched house and the pathless forest, of the greater design of the manor grounds. But perfection such as my landlord looked out on contained its own corruption. Perfection like that could too easily be taken for granted. There was nothing in that view, of ivy and forest debris and choked water meadow, which would irritate or encourage doubt. There was nothing in that view which would encourage action in a man already spiritually weakened by personal flaws, disappointments, and, above all, his knowledge of his own great security. The view, so complete, so simple, seemed to say or could appear to say, "This is the world. Why worry? Why interfere?" At the far end of the lawn, where a new wood began, offering little glimpses of hedges and overgrown paths and covered walks and stone urns, a wood which I was never to explore, at that end of the lawn there was a very large greenhouse. Its timber frame was solid, so solid that from a distance it all looked whole, a greenhouse in use. But the green behind the glass was the green of weeds growing unusually tall in the protected conditions of the greenhouse, a wilderness of weeds, and many of the glass panels had fallen. To me, with what I knew of old Trinidad estate houses in the French Caribbean style, there was about this greenhouse something, over and above the fact of its size, that suggested wealth. It had been overspecified, its timbers, the depth of the concrete floor, on 2 levels on the sloping site, its door, its hinges, its metalwork, everything was much sturdier than was strictly necessary. It was the way, perhaps without being asked, builders built for the rich, just as shopkeepers send up their best to the big house. There was something very satisfying about this style of building. Everything seemed so much itself. Everything seemed built for long use. There was no fragility, no anxiety. Over the hill, Jack also had a greenhouse, at the back, or perhaps the front, of his cottage, facing the old farmyard. That greenhouse would have been bought from a catalogue, like those advertised in the magazines with the television or radio programs. And how frail Jack's greenhouse had always looked, how slender its timber frame, how fragile its thin glass, even its floor of concrete. And indeed, when its time had come, how quickly it had all gone, all but the concrete floor, and even that had later disappeared. How quickly it had been cleansed of its greenhouse spirits. But this manor greenhouse, after 2 decades of neglect, still stood and from 50 yards still looked solid and whole, its timbers still painted, its thick concrete floor still uncracked, its doors swinging easily on its hinges. It would have been the work of a day to clean it inside, and the work of less than a week to recommission it again, to replace its wilderness with order. Bush inside the great greenhouse, bush outside. Pitten's lawn mower didn't come here until late in the season, and then, as everywhere else after the lawn mower had been, the grass showed level and flat and lawn-like and tended. But before that cut of Pitten's, it was necessary to hack through the nettles and the bush that grew thick and fast in the dampness to get to the first of the bridges that led across the water channels and creeks of the water meadow to the riverbank. At the other end of the lawn, where the water meadow met the orchard, there was a barbed wire fence in a ditch, in the midst of the water bush, to deter intruders. At this end there was only bush and something like forest debris. But here, in the days of the old life of the manor, there had been a series of railed timber bridges over the channels which, overgrown with willows that had then been blown down by equinoctial gales, had become like forest creeks, water appearing to be black over old leaves and mud, until you noticed the clear, clean colors of the leaves and the sky that the water reflected. In these hidden black creeks, so unlike the open meadows with yellow irises at the other end, there were often mallards. They took fright at one's approach, so used were they to their untroubled possession of these waters, or a particular willow-blocked arm of a creek. The bridges over the creeks of the water meadows had been built to high specifications, but over the years they had rotted in the water and had been further broken up by the growth of vegetable matter, even sturdy, tall-stalked nettles, and especially by the growth of the roots and trunks of willows. There still remained, that first spring of my walks and discoveries, a heavy gate at the end of the first bridge. This gate dragged, but its posts, though black and green with damp and disagreeable to the touch, still stood, and the gate could still be pulled shut and latched with a rusting catch. As a gate, a barrier, it was meaningless. The levels of ground and water had changed. The gate no longer guarded a dry walk across the water meadow. One could simply walk around the gate. There was a merest dip in the ground now, and the only inconvenience came from the nettles. But the nettles were everywhere. At one stage of this cross-meadow walk the weeds and reeds and willows and other wild growths were so tall it was hard to see the river. Then, quite suddenly, from the very last bridge, with many broken planks, big rusted nails alone remaining whole, the planks they had fixed having rotted away altogether, suddenly from the last bridge the end of the bush was clear, and a trimmed path along the river bank, beside the collapsed boathouse. This boathouse was a spectacular ruin. The mooring for the boat or boats was in a creek, one of the old channels of the water meadow. The thick timber posts or pillars of the corrugated iron-roofed shelter stood on either side of the creek. But tame though the river looked, a few feet deep, a few feet wide, the water it channeled was a force of nature, not wholly predictable, and the banks of that river and its inlets were constantly changing. The boathouse creek, widening or simply shifting, had caused the boathouse to collapse on one side. The angle of collapse, the rotting timber, the black-looking water, the rusting corrugated iron suggested a tropical river ruin, somewhere on the Orinoco or Amazon or the Congo. And yet, passing this ruin, and as though belonging to another order of nature, another order of society almost, was the trim path along the river bank. It was to that easy path, a path for fishermen, that the water meadow bridges were meant to lead. And the river itself flowed tidily and gently, and neat planks bridged the channels from the wet meadows to the main river. It was the hand of man, the hand of the water bailiffs and people like them, that suggested an orderly nature. Left to itself, the river, like the water meadow at the back of the manor, would have become a forest ruin. It took only one collapsed willow, blown down during a gale, say, to create a mess in the river, the banks wrecked, easy passage gone, tangled islands of river weeds and river dross with rippled skins of milky brown scum building up in a few days between the branches. The color of the river depended on what grew on the banks. And small though the scale was, the bank was varied. Where there were tall reeds or grasses on the water's edge, and the bank was overhung with trees, and if there were little indentations, miniature coves, in the bank, then the water was dark green, deep-seeming, and mysterious. Where the bank was clear, the water was clear, showing the white sand or chalk of the bed or the rippling green river weeds. There came a stage on my walk along the river bank when I stood directly in front of the water meadow where the yellow irises grew. Beyond that was the old orchard, with the box enclosure that lay to one side of my cottage. Above the orchard and the vegetable garden wall I saw the roof and chimneys of my own cottage below the beeches, and was surprised all over again, every time, that was where I lived. Not far beyond this point the walk that was permitted to me came to an end. Beyond that was another river, belonging to another landowner, and though it would have been easy to climb over the makeshift fence, I preferred not to do so. The river curved here. On the opposite bank the down ended abruptly in a wooded cliff, giving a great depth and a hint of surrounding forest to the river color. There was also a new channel here from the bare down, a spring breaking out of the chalk and quickly turning into a noisy cascade. So that again, in this neat, tame, smooth landscape, with a bare green-white down and with a river a few feet deep divided neatly into numbered beats, there was a reminder of the unpredictable force of water. Old corrugated iron sheets served as hatches in the new channel, an unexpected touch, in a landscape without people, of the urban slum. The water bailiffs had released young trout near here, and they hadn't wandered far. They were unexpectedly unattractive, as nervous as rats, of that color as well, and as swift and devious and silent as rats as they made for the camouflage of the dark river weeds. This was the river walk, barely 10 minutes, hardly a walk to someone used to walking most days for about an hour and a half. But the walk was always new, the river and what I saw always changed. There was the blue iris I saw in my first spring, solitary among the weeds and nettles at the edge of the water meadow. I was transported at the sight, and instantly had the wish, if I ever were to plant a garden of my own, to try to achieve that effect. And then, in the lightheadedness of my convalescence, I began, until I sobered up again, to walk through the nettles to the iris, as though the beauty of what I saw lay not in the setting, but in that particular iris. There were the scented old roses in the wild rose bed. And the roses I saw that first summer were the last I was in at that particular death. Because in the autumn Mrs. Phillips pruned them. Cut them right back, as she said, and those old rose bushes, cut down to the quick, all turned to briar again. There was a time of the spring or summer, every year, when a pale blue lawnweed floated like a blue mist above the daisy-spotted lawn. And always there was the river. It was the river, with its overwhelming beauty of reeds and weeds and moving water and changing reflections, that made me say, long before I felt myself in tune with other plants and truly in tune with the seasons, at least I've had a year of this. And then, at least I've had 2 years of this. And just as, on the walk over the downs past Jack's cottage, I always in the beginning looked for the warm brown fur of the hares, so on this shorter river walk I looked for the miniature volcano of the salmon's nest in the white chalk of the riverbed, and the still, dark pike waiting in a deep pool where the water was dark in the shadow of reeds. And I looked for the vole or water rat. I knew the little tree on whose lower branch he liked to sun himself, after shaking his fur. I often saw him swimming across the river, and once I saw him so soundly asleep that, thinking he was dead, I went and stood over him. I often heard the surprised plop of his fellows as they dived into their river holes, sending up silent muddy clouds. Every winter and spring created fresh havoc in the manor gardens and water meadows. The bridges over the channels decayed and decayed. The gate at the very last, or the first, bridge was eventually left open one year and collapsed finally of its own rot. The river changed its course by a few feet, washing over the path that the water bailiffs had kept clear, and the planks that spanned the channels were lost below water. New two-plank bridges were built, one plank plain, one covered with wire netting, for the grip it gave both to shoes and to the wheels of the bailiff's barrows. On this walk, as on the longer walk on the downs past Jack's cottage, I lived not with the idea of decay. That idea I quickly shed, so much as with the idea of change. I lived with the idea of change, of flux, and learned, profoundly, not to grieve for it. I learned to dismiss this easy cause of so much human grief. Decay implied an ideal, a perfection in the past. But would I have cared to be in my cottage while the 16 gardeners worked? When every growing plant aroused anxiety, every failure pain or criticism? Wasn't the place now, for me, at its peak? Finding myself where I was, I thought, after the journey that had begun so long before, that I was blessed. And then one day, quite unexpectedly, walking with freedom at the back of the manor, walking at the edge of both the ruined water meadow and the wild manor lawn, I saw my landlord. This was my second glimpse of my landlord. There never was to be another. And it was as confusing as my first, when I had seen him sitting beside Mr. Phillips in the motorcar, driving along the narrow road below the beeches planted by his father. I had barely seen him that time in the motorcar, had barely had time to focus on him, and the car had moved on, leaving me with a more precise, and surprising, picture of Mr. Phillips, happy, not at all irritable in the company of his master, more like an impresario, like a man who was fully himself, had a proper idea of his duties and worth. And just as after that first sighting my imagination had played with a half-impression of my landlord, now making him benign, now making him buttoned up, with dark glasses and the long hair of a Howard Hughes recluse, so now, because, being as nervous myself of being seen as he was, I turned away as soon as I saw him and never looked back. My memories were as much of the shock of the moment as of the man I had glimpsed. I saw him from a great distance, almost as soon as I had walked past the old rose bed, without roses now, a briar wilderness, long after that first summer of thorny, densely petaled, scented, lilac-pink roses, and had stepped onto the lawn proper, full of daisies. He was sitting in the pool of sunlight between the great evergreen that shaded much of the lawn, the big, partly broken greenhouse, and the wood at the side of the house, through which I had seen little paths, which I had never explored, for fear of intruding, for fear of disturbing my landlord, for fear of something very like this moment. He was sitting, as I thought or felt afterwards, in a canvas-backed easy chair in the sunlight, facing south, with his back to me. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat. That hat obscured the shape or the baldness or otherwise of his head, just as the canvas back of his chair obscured the bulk, or otherwise of his back or torso. From the first sighting I had had of him I had retained one clear physical detail, the little low wave he had given against the dashboard of his car. I had invested that wave with his shyness, the shyness of his illness, the shyness that went at the same time, as I thought, with a great vanity, the shyness that wasn't so much a wish not to be seen as a wish to be applauded on sight, to be recognized on sight as someone stupendous and of interest, and I had also invested that wave with his benevolence. From this second glimpse I again retained just one clear physical detail. It was of his crossed leg and his bare bent knee, shining in the sun. He was wearing shorts. They were tight around the plump thigh I saw. This wish of my landlord for nakedness and physical self-cherishing, stories had come my way, from the Phillipses and from Bray, the car hire man, whose father had worked in the manor long ago, of the great beauty of my landlord as a young man, This idea of beauty and the flesh now went with an opposite reality, the fatness of self-indulgence and inactivity. It is that detail, the pool of sunlight in the wilderness, the sun on the fat shining leg, that fixes the season for me. I knew of course that he kept to his room in the cold weather, and went out of doors only in fine weather. He had been granted at birth a great house and a wide view in the dampest part of the county, on the river bank, in a valley, which often, looking down from the viewing point on my other walk, I had seen covered entirely with mist. But his instincts were Mediterranean, tropical. He loved the sun. Inertia, habit, friendships, a wish to be where his worth was known. Perhaps these things had kept him in his inherited house. Perhaps if he could have taken friends and social connections, the knowledge in others of his social worth, everything that protected him, he might have moved. But he stayed in his house, which was his setting, and dreamed of being elsewhere, dreamed in his own way. He had sent me poems, in my first year as his tenant, about Krishna and Shiva. Mrs. Phillips had typed the poems out, and then she had brought them over in person to the cottage. It was my landlord's gesture of welcome to me, and so Mrs. Phillips treated it, adding to the gesture her own surprising reverence for the act of poetry making. Mrs. Phillips typed out and brought over more poems. She became as it were the living link between my landlord and me. I don't think he intended the courtesy to be quite like that, but that was how it fell out, and it made my settling into the cottage very much easier. Krishna and Shiva. There, beside that river, constable and shepherd, in those grounds. There was nothing of contemporary cult or fashion in my landlord's use of these divinities. His Indian romance was in fact older, even antiquated, something he had inherited, like his house, something from the days of imperial glory, when, out of material satiety and the expectation of the world's continuing to be ordered as it had been ordered for a whole century and more, power and glory had begun to undo themselves from within. Ruskinism, a turning away from the coarseness of industrialism, upper-class or cultivated sensibilities almost drugged by money, the yellow book, philosophy melting away into sensuousness, sensation. My landlord's Indian romance partook of all of those impulses and was rooted in England, wealth, empire, the idea of glory, material satiety, a very great security. His Indian romance, which had very little to do with me, my past, my life, or my ambitions, suited his setting. His Krishna and Shiva were names, and in his poems they were like Greek divinities, given the color of antique sculpture, literally touched with night blue, the color of wantonness, the promise of a pleasure, and beauty and Keatsian truth, that made the senses reel. The conceit about the painted statues was pleasing. I felt it was an old poem. And there was knowledge of a sort of the blue, aboriginal gods of the Hindu pantheon, the lascivious Krishna, the drug-taking Shiva, blue standing, in fact, for the black of the aboriginal inhabitants of India. But in later poems, some typed by Mrs. Phillips, some printed, single sheets, with drawings, a similar heady sensuousness was attributed to Italian youths of apparently the previous century or young Conradian sailors, again of apparently the previous century, in Peruvian or Malayan or Brazilian ports. His fantasies, sensual rather than explicitly sexual, to judge by the poems, were unconfined but also unfocused, a warm blur, something that was owed him but which perhaps might disappear with definition, something out there, outside himself, and eventually an aspect of his aesthesia, the curious death of the soul that had befallen him so early in his life. His anchor was his house, his knowledge of his social worth. Through all the ups and downs of his illness or his aesthesia, the knowledge of who he was remained with him. All the poems he had sent by Mrs. Phillips had been signed, extravagantly. There was about his signature, in addition to its size, something of the experimental nature of a boy's signature. It spoke of someone still savoring his personality. And now he sat before me, in a pool of sunlight in the grounds of his house, the house he had known all his life, next to the broken-paned weed-filled greenhouse, in the ruin of his garden. Semi-nude, his legs crossed, the fat right thigh, the thigh that was raised, and which I saw, tightly encased in his shorts. It was the Phillipses who had encouraged me to walk through the back garden and along the river bank, pooh-poohing as an unnecessary delicacy my wish to walk at the very limit of the lawn, beside the water meadow. Their own visitors were less circumspect. My landlord had his own patch, they told me. It was somewhere at the end of those overgrown walks through the wood at the far side of the house. I could walk with freedom. And I had done so for some years. I had certainly been observed by my landlord from one of the manor windows. And I believe that in his appearing where he was, there might have been an element of wilfulness. His movements out of the house were major affairs. Someone would have had to take the chair out for him, for instance. And perhaps it was out of a wish to show him, for his pettishness, his petulance, that neither Mr. Phillips nor his wife had told me that my landlord was sitting out in the back garden that day. His house, his garden, his view, his name. What did he see? Whatever he saw would have been different from what I saw. And so, after learning and possessing that view in the river for so many seasons, I was suddenly shocked, suddenly felt an intruder, as much as I did when one day Bray, the car hire man, in a special nostalgic mood, he had been quarreling with his wife and with Pitton, the manor gardener, who was his next-door neighbor, showed me a social magazine of the 1920s, and I had seen a handsome, self-aware group of young people of the period, sitting on the rails of one of the bridges over the creeks. Between the back lawn and the river. Another view, another place. What did he see, sitting there in his canvas-back chair? Did he see the tall weeds in the solid greenhouse, the tops of some of the weeds flattened against the glass? Was he agitated by the wish to put things right or by the idea of decay and lack of care? Did he see the ivy that was killing so many of the trees that had been planted with the garden? He must have seen the ivy. Mrs. Phillips told me one day that he liked ivy and had given instructions that the ivy was never to be cut. What were his feelings, then, when a tree collapsed? So many trees had collapsed. Such a wilderness now ruled in the water meadows, such a forest litter, with so many fallen willows, and the exposed Norfolk reeds then laid flat by the floods of a winter that for a week or so had cut an extra channel through the meadows on the opposite bank. He liked flowers. Pitton grew flowers for him in a corner of the walled vegetable garden. And from what I heard, he became passionate for flowers as soon as the weather brightened. He could not always wait for the flowers Pitton grew. He insisted then, after his winter seclusion, on going out to flower shops in Salisbury and other towns, sometimes making long journeys to certain favored garden centers to buy flowers and plants in pots. It was Pitton who reported to me that, on the way back from one of the flower expeditions, my landlord had seen the peonies below my window and in the shade of the yew hedge and had felt as I did about the depth of color of the overshadowed peonies. Pitton, reporting this, to please me, found himself in a quandary. The difficulty lay in my landlord's pronunciation of the word peony. Pitton didn't want to be disloyal to his employer. "He doesn't say peony like you and me," Pitton said. "He says peony." The word in this pronunciation rhymed with pony. Somewhere, was it at Oxford, or was it in the pages of Somerset Maugham, I had read or heard of this Edwardian affectation, an affectation known to be an affectation. Balcony rhyming with pony, and peony rhyming with pony. And the affectation that Pitton reported was strange. Like my landlord's knowledge of the value of his name, this affectation, the badge of a particular group, this class lesson from another age, had survived his desperate illness, his aesthesia. And forgetting this affectation, how did his taste for flowers go with the ruin of his own garden, the ruin through which, from his windows, he would have often seen me walking? Did he in fact see decay? Or did he, since vegetable growth never stopped, simply see lushness? Or did he cherish the decay, seeing in it a comforting reflection of his own aesthesia? That wouldn't have been too fanciful. It would have been like my own wish, coming to the cottage in his grounds, not to interfere, to take things as I found them, and then my later wish, out of my own delight in the place, not to see decay, not to be saddened by that too ready idea of decay, to see instead flux, constant change, and the feeling which I grew to cherish, that in the very dereliction of the grounds I had come upon them at their peak. That the order created by 16 gardeners would have been too much, would have made for strain and anxiety, that the true beauty of the place lay in accidental, unintended things, the peonies coming out very slowly below the thick dark green of the yews, the single blue iris among the tall nettles, the young deer that for many months lived among the reeds beside the rotting bridges over the water channels, having learned that the place was not frequented by men. I had come to the manor in a mood of withdrawal myself, and I understood how in that mood one would have felt mocked, it would have debilitated one, to make gestures that were too affirmative. As part of that wish to be unaffirmative, to take things as I found them, not to interfere, I had painted my room in the cottage a deep mauve. It was the least assertive color I could think of, and it came from something in my childhood. My elementary school in Port of Spain was in a street, Victoria Avenue, that ended in a cemetery. Nearly every afternoon after school I saw the horse-drawn hearses and the morning procession on foot passing the high, rubble-filled wall of the cemetery, named La Pérouse after the French explorer La Pérouse by our late 18th century French settlers, fleeing the effects of the French Revolution in Haiti and the other French islands. The horses that pulled the hearses to La Pérouse were covered with a reticulated pall, black or mauve. As a result, mauve, purple, was never for me the color of power and pomp, it was the color of death. In the mood I was in when I came to the cottage, any more affirmative, life-encouraging color would have been only mocking. Later that color became associated with the beauty and benignity and welcome of the place. And since one seeks to understand people by looking for aspects of oneself in them, I was willing to attribute something of the attitudes of my own withdrawal to my landlord. But perhaps there was as little pattern in his emotions, his sensual responses, as in his poems. He liked summer, the sun, flowers, ivy. Perhaps he was incapable of any effort to put things right. Or perhaps he was merely spoilt, and thought that however much the ivy and the gales destroyed in his garden, there would still be something for him to see, there would still be some sunshine in the summer, and some clearing in the ruined garden for him to sit out in. Ivy so covered and smothered some trees it was hard, especially for me, who knew so little, to tell what kinds of trees they were. A tree that collapsed one year turned out to be a cherry tree. I had known it only for its fitful blossom breaking through the ivy matting. Pittown and Mr. Phillips between them cut up the cherry trunk into discs. They used a chainsaw, and the discs were perfect little things, like toys, when freed of the ivy matting. I was offered some of the discs for my fire. I put the discs I had been given in my outbuilding, the half-cottage, against the vegetable garden wall, and left them there to dry. When they did dry out, I couldn't bring myself to burn them all. One disc I kept, as a souvenir of the garden, and I had it smoothed down and varnished. It had dried with its sheeny bark on. There were only a few spaces between the bark and the wood, and drying as slowly as it had done, the wood had hardly cracked. Just showing saw marks, and nondescript as wood, without a definite color, growing dusty in my outbuilding, the cherrywood disc came up beautifully when it was smoothed down. I counted the rings. There were 47. For its first 2 or 3 years the cherry tree might have grown in a nursery. So it might have been planted in the autumn of 1930. For the first 26 years the sapwood had grown at a healthy pace, and the color of the wood at the center was blonde. But then, for its last 21 years, the growth of the sapwood had slowed down, the lines of the heartwood had grown close together, and the outer wood of the disc was dark. Here in the secret vegetable life of the cherry tree of the garden was something like confirmation of what I had heard about the life of my landlord. In 1949 or 1950 to 1950 being the year I had left my own home island, had made my roundabout journey to England, looking for material to write about, and being as a writer, in the pieces I attempted, much more knowledgeable than I was as a person, hiding myself from my true experience, hiding my experience from myself. In 1949 or 1950 my landlord had withdrawn from the world, out of an excess of knowledge of that world. That probably was when he had given orders that the ivy was not to be touched. Up to that time the garden laid out by his parents had been more or less tended, in spite of everything, in spite of the war. 4 or 5 years later, going by the evidence of the rings on my disc of cherry wood, the ivy had taken, and 21 years after that the choked, strangled tree had collapsed and become part of the debris of the garden, the debris of a life. It occurred to me one day that at the time the ivy had taken or become established on the cherry tree, at the time my landlord's aesthesia had become permanent, While he was still a youngish man, I would have left Oxford. And since I had to do something, and since I had left home to be a writer, and no other talent or vocation had declared itself in me, I had set myself up as a writer, as deliberately as that. There was no joy in that decision. That was the blankiest and most frightening year of my life. And one day in the valley, for no reason, perhaps only for the sake of the thrill, as I was walking up the hill beside the windbreak of pine and beech and hawthorn and field roses to the viewing point, walking in that setting which had given me joy, a place like no other place in the world, I found myself thinking myself back into my personality of 25 years before, and felt again a panic I had all but forgotten. And the wish it had given rise to run and hide, having no money, no job, having developed no talent, having no place to return to that evening except a dark and very damp basement flat rented by a cousin, having nothing to offer my family who, since the death of my father the previous year, were psychologically dependent on me. Somehow I had done the writing. Somehow, and 20 years later, it was to seem such a piece of luck, I had engaged myself in the world. And 20 years of a life which had been the opposite of my landlord's had brought me to the solace of the debris of his garden, the debris of his own life. Debris which nonetheless never ceased to have an element of grandeur. A man with a simpler idea of himself, a simpler idea of his name, would have seen the great value of his property, might have realized its value, and lived elegantly elsewhere on the proceeds. But my landlord preferred to be with what he knew. Other people might contemplate a move for him. He himself could not think of a life away from his house and garden, which perhaps he continued to see in his own way, perhaps even saw as whole and perfect, the way we fail to see the tarnishing that has gradually come to flats or houses where we have lived a long time. The manner seemed so much itself, the style of things there so established, that the recentness of the decay was a surprise. And having learned to see that, I saw it in other places as well. I saw it in the cold frames just outside my cottage. These frames, intended as little nurseries, had low walls of brick, with the northern wall a foot or two higher than the southern, and they were roofed with great timber-framed glass covers, hinged to the higher, northern wall, so that the glass covers sloped south. These covers could not have been easy to lift. Like many other things in the manor grounds, they had been over-specified, heavy glass, over solid timber frames. At some stage the cold frames had been abandoned, and the heavy covers, taken off their hinges, had been set against the high vegetable garden wall. That was where I found them. They looked very old, with the weeds and grass growing around them. But when in the summer, going beyond what was strictly my own territory, and cutting the grass between my back door and the garden wall, with the manor's mower, filled by pit-ton with the manor's fuel, when in the summer I first cut that grass and took the mower right up to the garden wall and the glass covers, what a transformation! What had looked like bush in a long-neglected corner of the grounds came up, after its cut, looking level and neat. And it was as if the glass covers had been set against the wall just a few months before. The earth there, against the wall, had been made up partly of wood ash and reddish coal ash, perhaps even from the fireplaces of my own cottage, and perhaps before the days of refuge. Between this made-up earth and the side wall of my outbuilding there was a depression with a bulky metal grill, a soak-away, one of many set about the grounds, to drain the water that ran off the downs, the road, the paved lane, the lawn, the drive. Nothing was natural here. Everything was considered. Grass and trees concealed as much engineering as a Roman forum. Just one cut with the mower did away with the idea of wilderness outside the back door of my cottage, showed up the considered lines of wall and earth and outbuilding, and the solidity of the timber-framed glass covers against the wall. Still firm, the timber of those covers, still showing white paint. Few of the glass panes had broken. 4 or 5 had merely slipped from their cracked putties. And although the soil was poor, and was on the north side of the garden wall, and for much of the day was in the shade of the beech trees, yet the grass and weeds that grew between the glass covers had grown unnaturally tall and rich. And though in the brick-walled frames themselves, still edged with timber to receive the glass covers, there were drifts of beech leaves and beech mast, and out of the oddly yellow sand there grew nettles and ground elder and weeds whose names I didn't know, and many thorny blackberry bushes, yet that one cut with the mower around the cold frame did away with the idea of old decay, as, 5 or 6 years later, the rings in the disc of the collapsed cherry tree were also to do. It was oddly unsettling to see the ground at the back of my cottage come up again. Unsettling to deal with the idea that the dereliction of the place was new, the dereliction which to me had made it perfect as a place of refuge, and in which I had taken such comfort, that the place had been let go just a year or two before I had arrived, that the process of contraction, though begun 20 or 25 years before, had recently accelerated, and that my own presence there was part of that accelerating process. And the Phillipses too, when I had first met them, they had seemed to belong, to be part of their setting, to have been molded by the neglect by which they were surrounded. I had sat in their sitting room and looked out onto the mottled stone terrace, with its views of the untended gardens, the big trees, the overgrown water meadows obscuring everything beyond, the branches of shrubs in the foreground now hung with seed bells for the birds, and to one side, empty washing lines with a supporting prong pole. All that had seemed of a piece with the manor, and because I knew nothing of big house interiors and life, and brought to that interior and view only an imagination fed more by cartoons and films than by literature, I could think of no particular book with the setting, and because, in an unfamiliar setting in England, I fell into my old way of accepting or categorizing what I found as another example of English life. I thought that the Phillipses were examples of staff or servants living in the staff quarters of a biggish house. I attributed to them the manners of such people. It was disappointing to me to learn, as I did after a few months, that the Phillipses had come to the manor less than a year before me, that their manners were not the manners of servants or household staff but simply their own manners, the manners of people looking for peace and relishing the peace they had found at the manor. Though they looked settled in the quiet of the manor, and though they were of the region, they were not country people, but people of the town, with country town tastes. Though they seemed to be absolutely part of the manor, at ease in their quarters and indifferent to the dereliction around them, as though that had come so slowly they had not noticed, they were in fact rootless people, less rooted than Jack, over the hill. They had no house of their own, were planning for none. They lived in houses that went with the jobs they took, and though they were people nearing 50, as I thought, they seemed unconcerned about the time when they would be too old to work. Like their employer, my landlord, Mr. and Mrs. Phillips appeared to think that there would always be shelter for them. The car, the outings, the shopping in any one of the 3 or 4 towns that were near to us, the visits 2 or 3 times a week to a pub they knew well in any one of those towns, these were their pleasures, town pleasures, not country pleasures. And that appearance of being long settled and comfortable in their quarters, where the furniture, most of it, would have belonged to the manor, that appearance which so reassured and comforted me that first day, was part of their talent as rootless people. It was a talent not unlike Jack's, though it was not so immediately apparent. In the middle of farmyard dereliction and his own insecurity in his job and cottage, Jack kept his elaborate gardens and did his digging for vegetables and flowers and kept his plots in good heart. So, in the middle of an equal insecurity, since at any time their employer might die, and they would have to move on with their possessions to another job and another set of rooms, the Phillipses made their cozy home. Jack was anchored by the seasons and the corresponding labors of his gardens. The Phillipses had a different kind of stability. It was events outside their home, festivities outside, that gave rhythm and pattern and savor to their townish life. The outings, the visit 2 or 3 times a week to their pub, their annual holiday in the same hotel in the south. Probably this aspect of their life would have given the Phillipses away. They were not by social habits people of the village. They were not by instinct or character servants of a big house. They were people of the town, the outer world. And, if I had been told nothing at all, Mrs. Phillips's pruning of the old rose bed in the garden would have made me wonder about them. Such roses in the summer in that rosebush wilderness. And then in the autumn the bushes had been cut down to thick knotted stumps a few inches high, and Mrs. Phillips had often spoken of what she had done. "I've cut them right back," asserting so many things at once, boasting of her attempt to tame the wilderness at the back of the house, liking, at the same time, the severe business of cutting right back. and intending some slight rebuke to Pitun, the solitary gardener, who might so easily, had he been interested, had he really cared, have done the pruning she had had to do herself. There were no more roses. In the next summer there was only briar, a rampant, flowerless thicket. Briar swallowed the evidence of Mrs. Phillips's pruning, and she never mentioned it again, did nothing further in the manor gardens while Pitun was there. And perhaps when the cycle of the manor has truly ended, when everybody who knew the place then has disappeared, and new people with new plans walk about the grounds, that wild briar patch will be noted as proof of what can happen to untended, unpruned roses. Where, as a new arrival, accepting everything, I had seen people exemplifying their roles, soon it was the ambiguity of the Phillipses that made an impression, caught in my mind. They were people of the outer world acting out their role as house servants. And the ambiguity was real. Mr. Phillips had been a male nurse in a mental hospital, then he had worked in a hotel. In one of those places, a hospital or a hotel, Mrs. Phillips had begun to suffer from her nerves, and it was because of those nerves that they had come to the manor, to be a little withdrawn, to look after my landlord. So far from being a servant, Mr. Phillips had been in the business of restraining and disciplining people. And as often happens, people attracting people they need, Mr. Phillips, the strong man, attracted people, like his wife, with her nerves, whom he had to look after. And perhaps there was an extra happiness of this sort as well in his job in the house, with his employer, which would have explained his oddly happy, fulfilled look that day when I saw him driving his employer below the beeches on the ledge above the river. He was a man of medium height, perhaps even a small man. The cold weather clothes he wore, a heavy zip-up pullover, for the most part, concealed his physique. It was only in my second summer, perhaps because of what I had been told about him, and what he had told me about himself, I noticed his well-developed back, his great shoulders and powerful forearms, as of a man used to lifting weights. Every afternoon at about 3 I heard him shout from somewhere beyond the vegetable garden. After some time I knew what he was shouting. He was shouting, "Fred!" It was his call to Pitun to tea. Whether this was a gesture of friendship, whether it was something he was required to do, whether they all had tea together in the Phillipses' sitting room or in the kitchen, or whether Pitun just went and took away his tea, I don't know. There was an irritation and authority in that shout that made me think of the other manor, as it was known locally, where Mr. Phillips, and Mrs. Phillips as well, before her nerves, had worked. Once there were 16 gardeners. Now there was only Pitun. It was some time, a fortnight perhaps, before I got to know him, got to know that he wasn't just a visitor to the grounds, and it was some time again before I understood that he was the gardener, the last of the legendary 16. He didn't quite fit the role. There was nothing antique or forlorn or elegiac about Pittun's appearance. He was in his mid-50s, middle-aged rather than old. He certainly wasn't one of the original 16. He was a sturdy man, with a firm paunch, and of the utmost respectability in his dress. He wore, it was winter when I first saw him, a felt hat, a 3-piece tweed suit, and a tie. Always a tie on Pitun, winter and summer. Not only did he not look like one of the 16, he didn't even look like a gardener. At least, he wasn't my idea of a gardener. And that is a better way of putting it, because this business of gardens and gardeners called up special Trinidad pictures and memories, called up the history of my own small Asiatic Indian community, late 19th century peasant emigrants, and touched a nerve. As a child in Trinidad I knew or saw few gardeners. In the country areas, where the Indian people mainly lived, there were nothing like gardens. Sugarcane covered the land. Sugarcane, the old slave crop, was what the people still grew and lived by. It explained the presence, on that island, after the abolition of slavery, of an imported Asiatic peasantry. Sugarcane explained the poor Indian-style houses and roughly thatched huts beside the narrow asphalt roads. In the smooth dirt yards of those little houses and huts there were nothing like gardens. There might be hedges, mainly of hibiscus, lining the foul-water ditches. There might be flower areas, periwinkle, ixora, zinnia, marigold, lady's slipper, with an occasional flowering small tree like the one we called the Queen of Flowers. There was seldom more. There were gardens in Port of Spain, but only in the richer areas, where the building plots were bigger. It was in those gardens that, as a child, on my way home from school in the afternoons, I might see a barefoot gardener. And he would be less a gardener, really, less a man with knowledge about soils and plants and fertilizers than a man who was, more simply, a worker in a garden, a weeder and a waterer, a barefoot man, trousers rolled up to midshin, playing a hose on a flower bed. This barefoot gardener would be Indian. Indians were thought to have a special way with plants and the land. And this man might have been born in India and brought out to Trinidad on a 5-year indenture, with the promise of a free passage back to India at the end of that time, or a grant of land in Trinidad. This kind of Indian contract labor had ended only in 1917, antiquity to me in 1940, say, but to the barefoot waterer in the garden, still perhaps knowing only a language of India, a time within easy recall. This kind of gardening was a town occupation, barely above, perhaps even merging into, that of yard boy, which was an occupation for black people, and something so unskilled and debased that the very words were used as a form of abuse. After the war, a new kind of agriculture began to develop. Port of Spain had grown, and the lands of the Aranjuez estate, not far from Port of Spain, were taken out of sugarcane cultivation. Aranjuez, named in the late 18th century by the Spaniards after the town of Aranjuez in Spain, with the famous royal gardens. There was a certain amount of house building at Aranjuez, but to the south, on the edge of what was swampland, liable to flooding from the Gulf of Paria when the Orinoco River in Venezuela rose, on this land, on either side of the highway embankment the Americans had built during the war, former estate workers had leased plots from the estate, a few acres each, and had begun to develop vegetable gardens, slowly redeeming the land from swamp, building it up. The vegetables they grew, aubergines, beans, okras, had a shorter cycle than sugarcane, and they were correspondingly more demanding. They required finer attentions, and every day during a vegetable cycle the vegetable growers could be seen weeding or digging or watering or spraying, even when there was horse racing or an international cricket match in Port of Spain or some big festive event, working the way men work only when they work for themselves. Cocoa created the effect of a forest or wood. Sugarcane was a tall grass. The straight lines of these vegetable plots, the human scale, the many different shades and textures of green, gave us a new idea of agriculture and almost a new idea of landscape and natural beauty. The vegetable growers were Indian, but these vegetable plots were like nothing in peasant India. The skills, the practices, came from the experimental plots of the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, famous throughout the British Empire, which was just a mile or two away. Many of the Indian vegetable growers had worked there as garden laborers. And it was only some years after I had been in England that I saw that the landscape the Indian vegetable growers had created on either side of the highway in South Aranjuez, a landscape which had no pattern in Trinidad or India, was like the allotments I saw in England, at the edge of towns, from the railway train. English allotments in a tropical and colonial setting. Created by accident, and not by design, created at the end of the period of empire, out of the decay of the old sugar plantations. 30 years later the Aranjuez vegetable plots were to cover many square miles, land built up from swamp, season by season, creating a flat, wide, Dutch effect, extending all the way to swamp mangrove in one direction, and in the other appearing to go to the foot of the Trinidad Northern Range, now no longer green and empty, but covered on its lower slopes with the shacks of illegal black immigrants from the other islands. The landscape which, when I was a child, still retained some of its aboriginal, pre-discovery features, was to be irrevocably altered, and the people with it. 30 years later, at the time of the oil boom, many of those vegetable growers, or their descendants, were to become people of wealth, with children at schools or universities in Canada and the United States. But at the beginning, just after the war, when there were still damp, palm-thatched huts in the aboriginal reeds and sedge of the swamp beside the American-built highway, the labor of those vegetable plots, scientific though it was, still looked brutish and underpaid, an extension of plantation life, of mud and sun and bare feet, damp huts, and oily or sweated felt hats folded at the back to fit the head like a visored cap. Flowers were beautiful, everyone loved them. In Port of Spain there were the many acres of the Royal Botanical Gardens, established after the British conquest of the island, and the lily ponds and rockeries of the rock gardens. Both places were recognized beauty spots. But the idea of gardeners was not contained in the idea of the garden. In fact, it ran contrary to the idea of the garden. The garden spoke of Port of Spain and comfort, and a good office job and Sunday drives around the Queen's Park Savannah. The gardener belonged to the plantation or estate past. That past lay outside Port of Spain, in the Indian countryside, in the fields, the roads, the huts. Literature or the cinema, though I cannot think of any particular film, would have given the word different associations. But that knowledge, of swamp and estate and vegetable plot, was the knowledge I took to England. That was the knowledge that lay below my idea of the P.G. Wodehouse gardener and my idea of the gardener in Richard II, poetically conversing with a weeping queen. And inevitably I acquired new knowledge. There were the gardeners of the great parks of London. There was the gardener of my Oxford College, a mild, humorous, pipe-smoking man with, as I thought, the manner of one of the dons. And just as in the allotments beside the railway I had grown to see the original of the Aranjuez plots, so, coming to the manor, with its echoes of the estate big house and servants, and seeing around me the remnants of agricultural life, the remote, distorted original of the Trinidad estates, that earlier knowledge revived in me. But Pitton, the last of the legendary 16, was quite original. He appeared at 9 every morning at the wide, white-painted gate at the end of the lawn. And in his three-piece tweed suit he looked so unlike a gardener or any sort of manual worker. He so studiously avoided looking at my cottage, so carefully kept his distance, kept to the far path, that I thought he was going on through the back of the manor grounds to some quite different duties, and in opening the white gate was simply exercising some old public right-of-way. There was a certain amount of movement in and out of the manor grounds, and until his punctuality and regularity gave him away, I thought that Pitton might be one of those visitors, someone perhaps approaching the farmyard or the churchyard from a back way, and someone also with a right to use the water tap near the garden shed at the side of the squash court built like a farmhouse. We also had animal visitors. There was a black and white cat that came down the way Pitton came and, in the tall grass and weeds near the box hedge, became a great hunter. There was a Labrador dog that made an opposite circuit. He belonged to a house further up the valley. His master was away in London during the week, and on weekday mornings this dog did its own circuit of the water meadows. On sunny mornings from my sitting room I saw his tail bouncing up and down far away, saw no more, until eventually, having pushed through water meadow and overgrown orchard, the animal fetched up in front of my cottage, underbelly black and wet, paws black and wet. Like Pitton, he stuck close to the buildings on the other side of the lawn, and there was in his hunched shoulders, his looking straight ahead, a little like Pitton trying to give the assurance that he was minding his own business, some hint that he knew he was in territory not his own. The elegant fawn-colored creature was not liked by everybody. His morning circuit was not of the water meadows alone. He was also a hunter of dustbins. The Phillipses at the manor complained, even Pitton complained. A disappointment there, about the dog. A little like the disappointment I felt in Pitton himself when he, the carefully dressed, paunchy, staid figure, became known to me and turned out to be only the gardener. The wilderness that the black and white cat and the fawn-colored Labrador explored was the wilderness that claimed Pitton, or so it seemed, the wilderness which he entered every day as gardener. But he never came out as dirty or as wet as the Labrador. He came out as clean as the cat. The main reason was his steadiness, his refusal to hurry himself. Pitton knew how to pace himself. There was nothing in Pitton's labor of the attack or boisterousness of Jack when I saw him in his allotment, or garden. On some summer afternoons Jack worked barebacked. Pitton would never have done that. Pitton cared too much for the idea of clothes. If Jack's varied labors and varied dress, as I saw them in his after-hours garden, were like successive illuminations in a book of hours, exaggerated and emblematic, Pitton was a more modern man, a man of fashion. Yet in Pitton's fashionableness, his careful but regular buying of clothes that matched the seasons and were meant for that season's wear, in this very steadiness, this absence of waste, there was something like ritual. Clothes and the seasons ritualized Pitton's year. There was a time for the felt hat and the three-piece suit thorn-proof. There was a time for the straw hat. There was a time when the three-piece suit became a two-piece. There was a time for pullovers, one pullover, two pullovers. There was a time for country shirts, a time for lighter shirts, a time for a quilted jacket, a time for a dark, thin, plastic raincoat. His dress was absolutely suited to the work he was doing and the time of year. In that fine judgment about clothes and the weather, as well as in his steadiness, his physical pacing of himself, lay Pitton's extraordinary neatness. And in his clothes, his appearance, his refusal to look like a gardener or farm worker, a laborer, lay much of his pride. I thought that at least some of the vanity would have been given Pitton by his wife. She was a woman of a great, delicate beauty, which was extraordinary in someone of her station. Her complexion and features and her carriage suggested the nearness of some fine strain. Both Pitton and his wife were people without the gift of words. They had trouble finding words for what they had to say, so it seemed that they had very little to say. But the beauty of Pitton's wife was of such a sort that it overcame her intellectual, which was also her social, disability. It was always good to see her. Her near-dumbness was always a surprise. Beauty is beauty, though, and beauty is rare. No one who possesses it can be indifferent to it. And I thought that Pitton's clothes were meant, either by Pitton himself or by his wife, to match, to set off, Mrs. Pitton's looks. Then another idea was given me by a middle-aged English writer, a friend for many years, who was visiting one day. As a writer he was socially scrupulous, knowing how in England to look through both the caricature and the self-caricature. The writer saw Pitton. It was summer now, and Pitton was in his summer clothes, with his straw hat, picking his way back slowly to the white gate. Pitton's morning work was done. He was going home for lunch. He timed his lunchtime exit so that he would reach the white gate more or less at 1 o'clock. Pitton was on the far side of the lawn, not looking at my windows, staring ahead like the fawn-colored Labrador. Tony said, "Is that your landlord?" "He's the gardener," Tony said. "It proves something I've long held. People get to look like their employees." I hadn't truly seen my landlord and didn't know what he looked like. Tony had perhaps seen him years before, in London, in the days when my landlord was socially active, a man about town, before he had withdrawn. But Pitton's resemblance to my landlord, if such a resemblance did exist, couldn't have been induced in the way Tony was suggesting, the employee imitating the employer, and the employer then, out of laziness, out of being flattered, imitating the imitation of his employee. Pitton's resemblance to my landlord would have been an accident, a coincidence, because Pitton had come to the manor at about the time my landlord had withdrawn, at the beginning of my landlord's Great Depression. Even now, as I heard from the Phillipses, my landlord came out of his room only on the finest days, and Pitton hardly saw him. It was the Phillipses who mediated between my landlord and the gardener, or, more properly, the garden. My landlord couldn't have been Pitton's model. But I felt at once that there was something in what Tony had said or implied about Pitton, that the style was modeled on that of a superior. Pitton, as I heard, had been in the army in some capacity before coming to the manor. We were in a military area. And turning over this question of Pitton's model after Tony's visit, in fact, never losing the idea as long as I saw Pitton, it came to me that Pitton's model, with the encouragement of Mrs. Pitton, would have been an army officer of 20 or 25 years before whom Pitton had served or served under, someone still alive in Pitton's memory, Pitton's imitation this officer's chief memorial, perhaps. The army was still important to Pitton. His son was in the army. The progress, or the postings, of this boy was the only topic which could make Mrs. Pitton, blinking fast, speak a sentence or two. Normally she only smiled and looked pretty. We met occasionally at the bus stop, in the shade of the dark yews and beeches. There were not many buses, the road was fairly quiet, and voices at the bus stop sounded and echoed almost as in a room. We spoke about her son as though he were no more than a boy at school, as though, say, he was doing reasonably well with the books, but doing a little better in the swimming and the sports. The word school did in fact come up in Mrs. Pitton's talk of her son's army life. She told me at the bus stop one day. They've sent him to the artillery school. This would have been at Larkhill. Apt name once. These downs around Stonehenge rang at the appropriate season with lark song. But now, untouched though the green downs looked, Larkhill was the name of the Army Artillery School, booming away during the day and sometimes during the night and sometimes, if there was a big exercise, night and day. Because Pitton's son was there, and because Pitton told me of the great event, I went in my first summer to the artillery school's open day. It was like one of the summer rowing occasions at Oxford, when the families of undergraduates occupied the college barges. It was like the sports day at my school, Queen's Royal College, in colonial Trinidad. I recognized the occasion at once. Instead of masters and boys, there were officers and soldiers. Instead of sports, displays with guns, displays of great skill. But there was the same atmosphere of the fair, of food and women's clothes, of unusual colors, of normally hidden family relationships now publicly exposed, the same half-humorous loudspeaker announcements, the same atmosphere of dressing up and showing off, the same atmosphere of a society especially mixed for that day, boys and masters showing off at the school sports, men and officers showing off here, whole families showing off, women and girls displaying themselves, the poorer very concerned not to be outfaced. I could see the attraction of the occasion for the Pittons. I could see that it might well have been their most important social occasion for the year. And the open day did provide a little extra conversation for a while with Mrs. Pitton at the bus stop. Then she told me one day that her son had finished his training at the artillery school. It had gone well. His friends gave him a little memento. And believing perhaps that memento might be an army word, another special army word, as new and puzzling to me as it had been to her, she repeated it and explained it. A little memento of his time with them. An old-fashioned brass cannon set in clear plastic, like a diamond. A cheap souvenir, the smiling, empty-faced woman speaking of her son as of a child still. The memento. The bad art, the reality, the army, the soldier's son, should have matched. But the reality was different. The reality was serious. The Pitton boy was being trained as a killer soldier, the new-style British soldier. And he was suited to the part. He was a giant, with very big feet. The fineness of the strain that had produced Mrs. Pitton's features had ended with her or had skipped her son. It was astonishing that now, after its ineptitude in the 19th century, which was yet the century of the great glory of the Empire, and after its great but wasting achievements in the Second World War, at the end of that imperial glory, it was astonishing that now, when there were no more big wars for the country to fight, the British Army should be concentrating on producing this kind of elite soldier. There were occasional incidents in the little towns around Salisbury Plain. The taxi drivers sometimes had trouble at night. But in our valley we seldom saw a soldier or an army vehicle. Army vehicles seemed not to be allowed there. In our valley we lived protected from what surrounded us, just as in the 19th century the big industrialists lived in country estates outside the industrial towns where they made their fortunes. Pitton's boy came home one weekend with his girl. On Sunday afternoon he took her up to the viewing point. That was when I saw them. I was coming down the hill at the end of my own walk. The small girl clung to the giant, seeming to wrap herself around him, in a demonstrative way I had never seen in the valley. Or it might have been that I was at the age when I was able to observe these things with detachment, the detachment and knowingness I was aiming at when I was 18, and doing my drafts of gala night. The boy, the girl, the parents' house, the walk before tea, the tribal ritual, setting the observer at a distance. But how disquieting that boy's face was! In spite of his size, one could see the child his mother still saw, the unformed features still, the conflation of the two gentle faces, Pitton's and Mrs. Pitton's, the two simple, inarticulate people I knew, inarticulate but with their own vanities, the two faces meeting in the dangerous obedience, the new vanity, of the soldier. It was this quality of obedience in Pitton, the obedience he had passed on to his soldier son, that separated him from Jack. Over the hill, in a kind of no man's land beside the droveway and the half-abandoned farmyard, Jack did more or less what Pitton did in the wilderness of the manor grounds. But Jack was free in a way Pitun wasn't, and now could never be. Perhaps it was Jack's intellectual backwardness, his purely physical nature, that made him content with what he had. And that was not little. Jack was lucky in his circumstances, his cottage, the land he could till, and above all, his isolation, the silence and solitude he went to sleep in and woke up to. These circumstances, taken together, made his backwardness unimportant, and not the burden it might so easily have been in another place. These circumstances of Jack's, together with the nature of the man, made his life appear like a constant celebration. That labor in his garden, after his paid work on the farm, that exhaustion, the pleasures then of food and the drive to the pub, the long, muzzying drinks, the sight year after year of the sweet or beautiful, and profitable, fruits of his labor, why not, then, the bare back in the summer, as much as the fire in winter? There was a relish and a boisterousness and a toughness to Jack that neither Pitun nor his son would ever now have. The soldier's boisterousness of which Pitun's son was no doubt capable was perhaps like the boisterousness of the undergraduates in the cellar of my Oxford college before dinner, a form of caste behavior, something acquired, as unnatural as formal manners. Pitun wouldn't have cared for the brutishness and constriction of Jack's life, farm, cottage, garden, pub, all within a few miles. Pitun was more intelligent, had seen more. He had models where Jack had none. Pitun expected more for himself. He wished to offer more to his wife, of whose beauty, though I never heard him speak of it or hint of it, he would have been proud. But the superior intelligence and knowledge which made Pitun ambitious also made him obedient and vulnerable, put his life in the hands of others. So there was something in the simple first impression Pitun made on me, observing him enter the grounds by the white gate every morning at 9. He didn't look like a gardener. With his felt hat and tweed suit, he looked more like a visitor, like a man passing through. He was in fact going to the garden shed, which was also his changing room. He entered in his suit, a visitor; he emerged a gardener, having adapted his garb to the weather and job of the morning. But he had no idea of himself as the last of the legendary 16. He had another idea of himself, another idea of romance. And although, as we were to see, when the time came, he valued his job on the manner and the freedom of his job, he was unsupervised, and could work out his contracted hours as he chose, and although it was in his power to turn a blind eye to poachers or even some local gentleman looking for a little Saturday afternoon shooting, although, in outsiders' eyes, a little of the grandeur and privilege of the manor attached to Pitun, the manor formed no part of Pitun's idea of romance. And that was disappointing to me, that on the manor Pitun, like the Phillipses, and like me, was a camper in the ruins, living with what he found, delighted by the evidence of the life of the past, like a barbarian coming upon an ancient Roman villa in Gloucestershire, momentarily delighted by the wonder and ruin of a heating system he no longer understood or needed, like a barbarian in North Africa, brushing away new desert sand from a mosaic floor with gods now as mysterious and unnecessary as the craft of the mosaic floor itself, once hawked about by merchants traveling with patterns, stones, and journeyman floor layers, but not tormented in any romantic way by the idea of that life, not wishing to recreate or restore. It was Pitun who, after he had cut away through the orchard and woodland undergrowth to the garden refuge area, had shown me the thatched 2-story children's house, one of the refinements of the grounds, yet by its appearance never much used by children, more an adult refinement, a piece of period fantasy and elegance. Pitun understood that, and thought the children's house worth showing. But the garden refuge he had created over the years, especially melancholy with faded flowers and discarded flower arrangements, not all from the manor, some from the funerals in the little church, that spoke of death and the rituals of farewell, this refuge of Pitun's was just behind the children's house. The house, in fact, with its high conical roof served to hide the dump and made it more of a refuge. But if Pitun were not as equable as he was, if he couldn't live easily with the idea of ruin, if he had been one of the original 16 and had been weakened by elegiac fantasies, he might not have been able to do what he did do. That summer my first word came down from his employer, my landlord, that the hidden garden was to be opened up and cleaned. Hidden? Was there something in the grounds, apart from the lawn and the wood and the walks at the other side of the house that were for the exclusive use of my landlord, that I didn't know. There was the hidden garden. As it turned out, was so successfully hidden that, though I walked past it every day, I had never suspected that there was anything unusual there. It was a trick, like false books on a shelf. It was at the back of the main garage, and what looked just like the vegetable garden wall at the back of the garage was, in fact, the outer wall of the hidden garden. Behind that outer wall and the true wall of the vegetable garden was the hidden garden. It was enclosed on all sides, and entered by a wooden door. This door, which I passed every day, was permanently shut and seen from the outside to be one of the many doors or gates to the vegetable garden which, with the diminution of staff, the thinning away of the 16, had been closed forever. That door was now opened, and Pitun went to work, carting away barrow-loads of old wet dead leaves flattened by their own weight, and earth mingled with old beech mast. I noticed then his precise way with the loaded wheelbarrow, before pushing it off. He stationed himself carefully, and then, holding his arms straight down, after a pause bent his knees, so that in the process of holding and raising the handles of the barrow his back remained more or less straight. It made me think that this was probably how the men who carried sedan chairs in the 18th century handled their bodies, to prevent ache or damage. Barrow-load after barrow-load Pitun carted to the refuge, and in the hidden garden, below the tall, spindly-branched blossom trees, there came up, almost as new, a little tiled fountain, the tiles pale blue with spangles of gold. A frivolity, a little extra, a gilding of the lily, a little something else to do when all had already been done, something from the 20s or early 30s. The Phillipses called me to witness. Pitun called me to witness. We exclaimed, all of us, dutifully, at the secretness of the garden. The Phillipses exclaimed that something so beautiful could be so neglected. We all exclaimed that so many people had walked past the place without knowing, and we felt we were a little privileged, seeing what we did. But then no one seemed to know what to do with the hidden garden. The door was closed. The garden and the tiled fountain became secret again, and no doubt soon began to be covered again by the debris of leaves and beech mast and dead beech twigs. The fantasy of a summer for my landlord. Something one day, some quality of light, some object in the house, some letter, might have reminded him of that garden of his childhood. He wanted to see it. He sent down instructions. Pitun worked for a week. And when he had seen it he forgot about it again. Had he seen it though? Had he walked so far from his usual, protected beat? Had he come so close to my cottage, and what he would have considered the public part of the grounds? I never heard from Mr. or Mrs. Phillips that my landlord had actually gone to have a look. What had disappointed me no longer disappointed me. Pitun couldn't do the job he did, couldn't work with the knowledge that his labor was eventually to be wasted or mocked, couldn't keep a kind of order, couldn't hold back utter vegetable decay. If the glory of the old manor garden and the grounds had been part of his romance, if he had been one of the legendary 16. Pitun could do what he did because he had his outside, army or army officer, fantasy. And as a result, perhaps because of resentment of this outside life, this self-sufficiency of Pitun's, or perhaps because of resentment of his manner and pretensions, the idea that was put about was that, in the business of gardening, Pitun didn't really know. He grew vegetables and certain kinds of flowers that were required by the house, and that meant his employer. But somehow, in spite of this, he didn't really know, wasn't a true gardener, a man who possessed the mystery. And in this rebuke or resentment of Pitun there was contained an idea of the gardener which I felt to be very old, going beyond the idea of the gardener which I had found at my Oxford college, going back to the beginning of worship and the idea of fertility, the idea even of the god of the node, the gardener as the man who caused the unremarkable seed to grow into leaves, stalks, buds, flowers, fruit. Called this all up from the seed, where it has lain in small, the gardener as magician. Herbalist, in touch with the mystery of seed and root and graft, which, with the mystery of cooking, is one of the earliest mysteries that the child discovers, one of the earliest mysteries that I, my sister, and my cousins discovered when in the hard yellow earth of our port of Spain yard we, taking example one from the other, and just for the sake of the magic, planted hard dry corn, maize, 3 seeds in a shallow hole. Fenced the whole round with a little palisade of sticks, to protect it from the chickens that ran free in the yard, and then 3 days later, in the morning, before going to school, discovered the miracle. The maize shoots that morning breaking the earth, the green outer sheet developing quickly into a thin leaf curling back on itself, like a blade of grass, like sugarcane, developing until the child became bored, ceased to watch and protect. And the chickens knocked the stick palisade down, and pecked the still tender plant down to nothing. It was this childhood sensation, this childhood delight in making things grow, that was touched in England when I saw the vegetable allotments at the edge of towns, beside the railway tracks. I attributed to the people who worked in those allotments something of what I felt as a child when I planted my corn seeds, felt it as old, that emotion, that need, surviving here, in England, the first industrial country, surviving in the hearts of dwellers in the ugliest and most repetitive Victorian industrial towns, surviving like the weeds that grow in the artificial light and polluted air of railway terminals, growing in the oily gravel between the rails almost against the buffers. That instinct to plant, to see crops grow, might have seemed eternal, something to which the human heart would want to return. But in the plantation colony from which I came, a colony created for agriculture, for the growing of a particular crop, created for the great flat fields of sugarcane, which were the point and explanation of everything, the houses, the style of government, the mixed population, in that colony, created by the power and wealth of industrial England, the instinct had been eradicated. The vegetable fields of Aranguez in Trinidad, on either side of the American highway, had been created by accident, with the debris, the accidental diffusion among laborers, of the learning of the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture. They looked like the allotments in England, and there was a connection of learning, of science. But the plots of Aranguez at the edge of Port of Spain and the allotments at the edge of English towns spoke of different instincts, needs, different hearts now. The old world, of planting and fertility, the very early world, perhaps existed in the colony, and only for a short time, in the child's heart. Adult eyes saw in agriculture not magic but servitude and ugliness. And that was why the English allotments touched something as small and as far away and as vague as my memory of planting 3 seeds of corn in the yard of our family house in Port of Spain. The idea that Pitton didn't know was something in the air at the manor. It was an idea that came to me gradually, with knowledge of my surroundings. I do not remember Mr. or Mrs. Phillips offering it as a statement. So I suppose that the idea would have been put to me in a number of indirect ways by the Phillipses before I had settled in and learned to look around me and come to my own judgments. I assumed, for instance, that it was because of this idea that Pitton didn't know that Mrs. Phillips in my first autumn, and really, as I was to understand, not long after she herself had come to work and live at the manor, cut back the old overgrown moss rose bushes in the overgrown rose garden and reduced them to rampant briar. When the spring came and the true rose leaves didn't show among the 7-leaved briar stems and the thorny rosebuds didn't appear, she said nothing. She dropped the subject of the roses and the pruning. It was one of my early lessons in the valley in the idea of change, of things declining from the perfection, as I thought, in which I had found them. And though every May for some years afterwards, when I was there, I looked for those buds in spite of the briar, hoping for magic, this silence about the roses was for me a way of coping with the disappearance of the roses. What was perfection to me would have been decay to the people before me, and hardly conceivable to the first designers or gardeners. Nothing more about the roses, then. But by this time Pitton had been given his character. And increasingly I felt it as odd that this resentment of Pitton as a man with an insufficient grasp of his mysterious craft, a man without the true vocation, should come from people, the Phillipses in the manor, and Bray, Pitton's immediate neighbor, none of whom could be said to have vocations or trades, people who, for this reason, in this agricultural, non-industrial part of England were curiously unanchored, floating. The Phillipses I thought of as people getting by. It was impressive to me, who had lived all my life with anxiety and ambition, to discover that they had no plans for their future, had almost no idea of that future, had planned for nothing, and lived with the assumption that somehow, should things go wrong here, there would always be a kind of job, with quarters, for them somewhere else. It was impressive to me, and I don't mean it ironically, this readiness for change, for living with what came. But it contained no idea of the vocation or achievement. It contained only this idea of getting by, of lasting, of seeing one's days out. And the same was true of Bray, Pitton's neighbor. Bray was a car hire man, and though he was more rooted than anyone in the village and was as close to the manor as anyone could be, his father had worked in the manor in the old days. He, who rebuked Pitton for not knowing about gardens, had so little feeling for gardens and even for the valley in which he lived that he had turned all the front part of his house plot into a concrete area for his various, always changing, vehicles. The Phillipses, who gave Pitton tea every day, the cry of "Fred!" from Mr. Phillips had tones of authority rather than friendship or fellowship, made no direct statements about Pitton to me. Bray wasn't like that. Bray was more open. It was his independent style. He was proud of this style. He was open about my landlord. He wished that openness to be noted. He said, raising the topic himself. Wouldn't have him in the car. Like a bloody bird. Wants to sit in the front. Then he wants to sit in the back. Then he wants to sit in the front again. And of Pitton Bray said more than once. He's a very arrogant man. Arrogant. Like. Commonest. Was one of Bray's words. Arrogant was primarily Bray's version of ignorant, but it also had the meaning of arrogant, and this word, when used by Bray, with its two meanings and aggressive sound, was very strong. Pitton and Bray lived in adjoining semi-detached cottages on the public road. The cottages had slate roofs and walls of flint and red brick, with the brick in regular two-course spans. Both cottages had once belonged to the manor, and like the picturesque, thatched cottages not far away, like the manor itself, had been built by the manor estate before the First World War. Pitton's cottage still belonged to the manor, the cottage went with the job. But Bray owned his cottage. He had inherited it from his father, who had worked all his life at the manor and had bought the cottage for very little. The sale was in the nature of a benefaction to him, when the manor estate had begun to shrink, the family being active elsewhere. The smallness, sturdiness, the straight lines in the materials, red or orange-colored brick and flint, had made me think of those cottages as semi-urban. But then, getting my eye in, I had seen the style in old farm buildings for many miles around, had seen it as the local way with flint, which was so plentiful here, and I had grown to understand that the cottages had been built as experimental, improved, agricultural cottages. They were as a result more genuinely, now than the thatched cottages just down the road. The thatched cottage still stood for an idea of the rural picturesque, and thatching was far from being a vanishing skill. Thatchers were at work in all the valleys of Wiltshire. But the building style of the improved cottages, the flint and the bands of brick, was no longer practiced by the local masons. That particular skill with flint was hard to come by, and the social idea of improving cottages for agricultural workers no longer had a point. Similar houses, then, for Bray and Pitton, houses with an easily readable past. But on Bray's side of the party wall and fence there was the idea of proprietorship. Bray owned his house, he wanted that to be known. And to that he added the idea that he was a free man, a man who worked for himself. On Pitton's side there was the idea of style. Pitton kept a tidy garden, with a hedge, a patch of lawn, and small flowering trees. Bray's garden was more a concrete yard for his cars and minibuses. And that was the cause of some trouble between the two men. Pitton said nothing about Bray. Everything I learned about the running dispute between the two men I learned from Bray. I used his cars. Bray told his stories in his own way. He suppressed his own actions and provocations. He reported only what Pitton did. And the effect of this was to turn Pitton, so well dressed, so steady in the manor grounds, his gait so measured, the effect was to turn this man who was a paragon in public into a madman at home. Bray would say as he was driving me to the railway station, "Our friend has taken up building these days. Drilling holes in the party wall at 3 o'clock in the morning. What do you think of that?" And so Bray would allow one to play for a while with this picture of Pitton as a madman with the electric drill, raging about his house at night, a Mr. Hyde with a modern ray gun, yet somehow sobering up sufficiently to appear neatly at 9, a Dr. Jekyll of the manor grounds, at the white gate of the lawn. And it would be only at the end of the ride with Bray, or during the next ride, or the ride after that, that I would learn that Bray, for every kind of good reason, his passion for work, his self-reliance, his hatred of the idleness which was undoing the country, the unreliability of other people, for all these very good reasons Bray had been taking down or tuning motorcar engines in his paved yard until well after midnight. In Bray there was an element of perverseness. He knew that his paved and oil-stained yard and his half-taken-down motorcars offended people. He knew that they were an especial offense to Pitton, who lived next door. He knew, too, that it was inappropriate, a noticeable disfigurement of the valley which he was anxious for his tourist passengers to see. But Bray, though he would have denied it or not found words for it, wished to offend Pitton's idea of correct behavior and style. And there was the added reason that Bray felt he could do as he pleased with his ground and house because they were his and because he, unlike Pitton and unlike nearly every working man he knew, was a free man. Freedom was important to Bray. And though he presented the car hire business and the taking of people to the various terminals of the many airports and the picking up from the airports of foreign children, though he presented this as a high skill, almost a vocation, equal to anybody else's, his vocation was really to be a free man, not to be what his father had been, a man. In service, a servant. Service, a world dead and gone. But not to Bray. His childhood lay there, just as my childhood lay in the vanished world of sugarcane fields and huts and barefoot children, and ditches and hibiscus hedges, and religious ceremonies which I accepted but didn't understand, and the beauty of the lighting of the lamps after the prayer in the evening, and the fear of the rum shops and the quarrels and fierce fights. Just as estate laborers, gardeners, called up special pictures for me, so Bray lived with pictures of the valley I could only dimly visualize. He spoke often of the past to me. He spoke of harvest time and children taking tea to their fathers in the fields, of shepherds and their huts on the downs, of laborers who were granted vast daily allowances of beer, of picturesque clusters of laborers' cottages, now knocked down. So far from concealing his background, he always brought it up, to remind himself, and me or whomever else he was talking to, of how far he had come. What had Bray's father been? He had said at first the head gardener, the top man of the legendary 16. And perhaps only someone like that would have had the privilege of buying his cottage at a very low price. But later he had also said that his father had been the butler, the chauffeur, and sometimes even the coachman. There were wagons in the sheds next to the antique, ivy-covered granary. So it is possible that this claim that his father had been head of the legendary 16 was only Bray's way of putting down the arrogant Pitton. Whatever his father had done at the manor, Bray was proud of his father, did not reject him. But connected with the father's service at the manor was a memory that touched Bray himself, and still caused him pain. He began to tell me one day of the time he had gone to work at the manor during the holidays from the village school, now no longer existing as a school, existing only as a building, a cottage, a desirable dwelling. It was an important memory. It still caused him pain. He could talk about it to me because I was a stranger, because I could understand, and because I was interested. I had developed a lot since 1950, had learned how to talk, to inquire, and no longer, as on the SS Columbia and in the Earl's Court boarding house, expected truth to leap out at me merely because I was a writer and sensitive. I had discovered in myself, always a stranger, a foreigner, a man who had left his island and community before maturity, before adult social experience, a deep interest in others, a wish to visualize the details and routine of their lives, to see the world through their eyes. And with this interest there often came at some point a sense, almost a sixth sense, of what was uppermost in a person's thoughts. So Bray began to talk one day of his holiday service in the manor. But something then occurred, perhaps a stop at traffic lights, perhaps some altercation or exchange of greetings with another driver. And then the pain of the memory came. Bray's wish to tell me his story, and the days he had spent as a servant in the manor remained secret. Perhaps it was his acquiescence in the role that caused him pain. Perhaps he saw it as an exploitation of his innocence, his childishness. Children, whose experience is so limited, readily accept an abused condition. Even his play can encourage a child to live with his abused situation, can encourage masochism in someone meant to be quite different. Thinking back to my own past, my own childhood, the only way we have of understanding another man's condition is through ourselves, our experiences and emotions. I found so many abuses I took for granted. I lived easily with the idea of poverty, the nakedness of children in the streets of the town and the roads of the country. I lived easily with the idea of the brutalizing of children by flogging, the ridiculing of the deformed, the different ideas of authority presented by our Hindu family, and then, above that, by the racial colonial system of our agricultural colony. No one is born a rebel. Rebellion is something we have to be trained in. And even with the encouragement of my father's rages, political rages, as well as rages about his family and his employers, there was much about our family life and attitudes and our island that I accepted, acceptances which later were to mortify me. The noblest impulse of all, the wish to be a writer, the wish that ruled my life, was the impulse that was the most imprisoning, the most insidious, and in some ways the most corrupting, because, refined by my half-English half-education and ceasing then to be a pure impulse, it had given me a false idea of the activity of the mind. The noblest impulse, in that colonial setting, had been the most hobbling. To be what I wanted to be, I had to cease to be or to grow out of what I was. To become a writer, it was necessary to shed many of the early ideas that went with the ambition and the concept my half-education had given me of the writer. So the past for me, as colonial and writer, was full of shame and mortifications. Yet as a writer I could train myself to face them. Indeed, they became my subjects. Bray had no such training, no such need. The pre-war depression, the war, the post-war reforms and boom lay between him and his past. The further away he was taken from that past, the more the world changed, the more perhaps it pained him. Politically he was a conservative. "You know me," he would say. "I'm a down-and-out Tory. Running together, downright, and out. By that, being a conservative, he meant really that he worked for himself and was a free man, that he had less regard for people, like Pitton, who lacked the will to be free and worked for other people, and that he had no regard at all for people who were parasites on the state, and hated the idea of paying taxes to support these people. With this Toryism, however, and his hatred of the Labour Party and the Communists, there went a strong republicanism. He depended for his livelihood on people with money. He liked the odd ways of the rich and liked to talk about these ways. But at the same time he hated people who drove Rolls-Royces. He hated landowners, people with titles, the monarchy, and all people who didn't work for a living. He hated titled people and old families and people of inherited wealth in a way I wouldn't have thought possible for an English person, until I read William Cobbett. There, in the prejudices and strong-headedness and radicalism of 150 years before, a radicalism fed by the French Revolution, which in the pages of Cobbett, in the living, breakneck speed of his prose, could still feel close, I found many of the attitudes of Bray. An empire had intervened, a great new tide of wealth and power, but the passions of Bray were, miraculously, like the passions still of a purely agricultural county, the passions connected with manors and big farms and dependent workers. Much of this, with Bray, was rooted in his own family connections with the manor, and with some still rankling humiliation connected with his holiday period, in service, there. Pitton, the gardener with the tied cottage, dressed carefully. He aimed at a kind of country gentleman style. Bray, the free man, wore a driver's peaked cap. He said, when we were some months into our business relationship, which had developed into something like a village acquaintance, that he wore the cap because it helped with the police. And he was right, as I saw on many occasions, especially at the airport. The police, uniformed themselves, acknowledged the peaked cap, responded to it, and were easier, in every way, with this badge of a trade. He also said another time that he wore the cap to distinguish himself from the ordinary taxi drivers, who spent so much time parked and idle and skylarking. But they, the taxi men, thought the peaked cap servile, mocked Bray for it, as they criticized him for his low charges, seeing servility there as well. And that Bray's servility, and general old-fashionedness, was the reason why Bray, who, because he was punctual and reliable and fair, had built up a bigger clientele than he could single-handedly manage. That was the reason why Bray couldn't get a driver to work for him for any length of time. Bray asked too much of the drivers he employed. He wished them to work the hours he himself worked. He wished them to dress formally, even to wear a uniform. Bray himself didn't dress formally. He wore the peaked cap. But everything else he wore went counter to the suggestions, the implied deference, of that cap. He wore a cardigan mostly, very seldom a jacket. A cardigan can be unbuttoned or buttoned in many ways. It can suggest formality, casualness, indifference. It can suggest, as Bray often made it suggest, a man called away from fireside and slippers and television. And the peaked cap, it would be set at many different angles. It could express regard or disregard. Set correctly, that cap, together with a buttoned-up cardigan, could suggest not deference so much as a man handling himself with care, a self-respecting more than a respectful man. The cap helped Bray to assert himself, to pass opinions and judgments on people he came into contact with. It would have been harder for him without the cap. He would have had to find words, set his face in different ways. He would as a result have been constantly embattled, the car hire or taxi business being what it is. The peaked cap, with its many angles, together with the various ways of wearing the cardigan, enabled Bray to make clear, a whole range of subtle judgments. In fact, for the very reason that he was reacting against the service manner of his father, Bray had the variable, fluid personality of the servant, the various accents, voices, expressions. Bray, unlike Pitton, had no model. And depending on himself alone, he gave a distinct impression of oddity. And that variable, passionate personality of Bray's, that many-sided personality, was perhaps fundamentally unstable. He didn't serve the manner. There might have been some quarrel there, about which I knew nothing. The Phillipses never mentioned it, and the quarrel might have been before their time. Yet his resentment of Pitton was also partly the resentment of someone he felt to be an intruder. Because he, Bray, felt and claimed that he knew more about the manor and our landlord than Pitton ever could. Similar houses, improved agricultural cottages, and both with working men who, for all their differences and conflict, aimed at the same thing, dignity. So tensions surrounded Pitton both where he lived and where he worked. Because at the manor Pitton returned or vented to the full, but on the Phillipses, Bray's resentment of him as an outsider and interloper. Pitton, in spite of his button-up look and lack of words, had his way of passing on his feelings, and, as much as the Phillipses might indicate to him that he didn't know, he could pass on to them that they were townies, newcomers in the manor. So these three sets of people, so physically close, and all in different ways, in service, lived in a net of mutual resentment. An odd thing about them was how differently they dressed. Choice in dress, cheap versions of stylish clothes, was limited by what the shops in Salisbury offered. And though I soon got to know the shop or outfitters, where Pitton bought his country gentleman clothes, and they were not particularly cheap, and the sports shop, much cheaper, where the Phillipses bought their padded anoraks or zip-up pullovers, and though I couldn't help seeing the clothes as merchandise, not truly personal to the wearer, more as samples of a vast stock, and though the shops in Salisbury were so close to one another, yet this difference in their clothes was important to them all. And all these people were tough, or insensitive, or partly blind to their condition. They needed to be. Bray earned the freedom he was so proud of. He never turned a job down and worked prodigious hours. He had nothing like a connected private life, and seldom had a full night's sleep. The Phillipses were tough, even Mrs. Phillips nervous, and liable to headaches, living as they did with nothing put by, and with the knowledge that at any moment they might have to leave and live elsewhere, with other people, other relationships, other conditions. And Pitton lived not only with the irritations of Bray and the Phillipses, but also with the knowledge that away from the vegetable garden all his labor, not voluntary like Jack's, but paid, his job, was in the wilderness of the manor grounds, repetitive brute labor, with hardly anyone to notice, like the clearing away of the dead leaves of autumn, pointless labor, like the cleaning of the hidden garden, which had then been simply closed up again, labor in grounds awaiting a successor. His improved agricultural cottage, the garden shed, the manor grounds. This was his little run, a dreadful constriction, if it was all he had. He needed the other idea that he had, the country gentleman idea. Unsupervised, without fixed hours, he might, without that other idea and the temperament it gave him, have become slacker, might have degenerated into a tramp, become a jack without the zest, the true coarseness, the life. I had a taste of Pitton's temperament myself in my second summer. I had gone away, done some traveling, and come back almost at the end of the summer. I found that the grass around my cottage had not been cut at all in my absence. A mere fringe of ground around the cottage was technically mine to look after and keep in good heart. 5 minutes' work with the mower, no more. But this little area Pitton had scrupulously left alone, though it spoilt the appearance of the lawn. Mrs. Phillips said, "People are funny," as though at last I had been given an idea of what they had to put up with. She would have watched the grass and weeds grow during my absence. She would have waited with some pleasure for my reaction when I got back. I had no wish, though, to get drawn into the resentments and quarrels at the manor. When I saw Pitton in the grounds, I went to him and asked him to lend me his mower. He was abashed. He had set up a little quarrel, a little tension, and had done so for some weeks in the full sight of the Phillipses. And now, at what should have been the climax, quarreling time, he was abashed. What he had done in the sight of the Phillipses. But he didn't know how to quarrel with me, a stranger. It was touching. He began to mumble some explanation, but then thought better of it. He went directly to the shed and brought out the mower and a tin with the fuel mixture. He was solicitous. He even gave me a rag to wipe the mower casing after I had filled the tank. When I was finished with the mowing, I took care to leave the mower and the fuel tin just outside the locked door of his garden shed, as though letting him know by this dumb show I hadn't been so careful before when I had used his mower, that I wasn't taking him for granted. And he responded in a way I never expected. On the Thursday afternoon he took my dustbin to the manor courtyard for the Friday morning dustbin collection. He lifted the filled metal bin by one handle only, using only one hand, and not altering his gait or normal walking pace, a demonstration of his great strength, in spite of his age and paunch and apparent slowness. So we became friends. And on some afternoons of the late summer and early autumn, sunshine and shadow on the lawn, we worked together. He allowed me to help with the last cutting of the lawn. I always liked cutting the lawn. And I helped with the gathering of the leaves, a pleasant mid-afternoon activity, for an hour or so, oddly serene, stacking the leaves into a roughly carpentered two-wheeled cage trolley, pushing that through the orchard and past the children's house to the refuge, removing the front of the trolley, tilting the trolley forward and then spreading out the leaves on the springy, slippery leaf hill. A few days before Christmas I went to Pitton's house to give him a bottle of whiskey. It was damp and cold, the road ran with wet. The beech trees and the sycamores, though without leaves now, still seemed to keep out the sun. Pitton's gate and the paved path to his front door were in better shape than Bray's. It was only when I was right at Pitton's door that I noticed how badly in need of paint the door and timber surround were, and that the front casement windows were half rotted. It was a long time before Pitton came to the door. Perhaps he had had to prepare to dress. And there was an embarrassment about him, a tightening of his face, which let me know that he didn't like being caught in his house. The house was much poorer than I thought. The improved agricultural cottage of 60-odd years before, however sturdy its external appearance, was a little ragged and knocked about inside. The narrow hall was shiny with rubbing, hardly a recognizable color. The small front room was scrappily furnished. Modest furniture which, though old, still made one think of the shops where it had been bought. Modest television and hi-fi, which again made one think of cheap shops, cheap unlined curtains. Only the photographs, of Pitton and his wife together, younger, of Mrs. Pitton alone, 20 years before, a photograph with which she was clearly pleased, looking over her shoulder, a photograph of the son. Only these photographs made the room, which had been Pitton's for so long, personal. The casement windows, as I could see more clearly from the inside, were warped. The room was draughty. Why hadn't Pitton done something about the decorations? I know what he would have said. Decorations were the estate's responsibility, the house wasn't his. He was waiting for the estate to decorate his front room and no doubt the rest of his house. He was content to allow time, a portion of his life, to pass in drabness. It was disappointing. Here was the true servility, the true obedience of the man. It was hard, faced with his gravity, his measured movements, his weighty manner, his self-cherishing, to grasp that other fact about him. So much of the money he earned, then, went on clothes for himself and Mrs. Pitton, that showed to the outside world about which they were both so particular. I gave him the whiskey. He thanked me, but he didn't look especially pleased. His tight expression didn't go or soften. That expression softened, the muscles of his face grew slacker, only when, making conversation, covering up what I now recognized to be the error of my visit, I mentioned his hi-fi equipment. I said I had nothing like that myself. The tight, embarrassed look on Pitton's face was replaced by a foolish, self-satisfied smile. He was glad, it was amazing, he was glad his possessions had surprised me. And that foolish smile of Pitton's took me back to early childhood, like a dream here, in this valley, in this house of Pitton's, and to painful memories. Within our extended family our little unit was poor, and I remembered, on the one or two occasions when remote, richer branches came to visit us, how strong the instinct with us was to boast, to show off, to pretend that we were richer than we were letting on. Curious instinct, we didn't boast with people who were as poor as ourselves. We boasted to people who were richer, who could easily see through our vanity. I had seen it in others too. My earliest observations as a child were about the lies of poverty, the lies that poverty forced on people. We were a very poor agricultural colony at the end of a great world depression. Very few people had money, great estates had to be sold for very little, money being so scarce, and among the laborers there was great distress. Yet as a child I saw people pretending to their employers, to the people who paid them every week, that they, the paid people, were richer than the payer knew, that they, the daily or the weekly paid, people who worked for 8 hours or more a day for less than $1 a day, had secret means and, almost, a whole secret life. Something of this, some whiff of huts and damp and the swamplands of my childhood, came to me at Christmas, in the Wiltshire Valley, in Pitton's improved agricultural cottage. He was poor. I discovered now that he was hurt by his poverty, ashamed of it. I discovered now that his nerves were rawer than those of the Phillipses or Bray. He was much more vulnerable than they were. The shout of "Fred!" came from somewhere in the manor at about 3 o'clock. It had taken me a little time to work out that was being shouted, the shout having at first seemed like another of the many country noises, the cry of some animal, the far-off cuckoo-like shout of the cowman driving the cows back from the water meadows to the milking shed. He was simply shouting, "Go on! Go on!" Farm machines, birds, the flap of pigeons' wings as they fluttered about their perches or roosting places in the thick ivy on the old granary wall, the antiquated milking machine from the farm beyond the churchyard. This machine rose to a scream just before it was turned off, making you aware then, in the comparative silence, of the whine with which you had been living for the previous 2 hours. A whine which lingered like a ringing in the ears or like the sound of cicadas, the drone and roar of military aircraft. When I had worked it out, the shout of "Fred!" from Mr. Phillips became quite distinct, and I thought it was part of an old routine, something that had existed long before my time. I soon discovered that it wasn't so. And I was able to give a character and mood to the shout, and to understand the tensions that played around it. Pitton, I then realized, never acknowledged the shout or called back. It was an afternoon shout. But sometimes, and especially in the spring, it could be heard in the morning. It meant then that Mr. Phillips was mediating between my landlord and Pitton. In the spring my landlord wanted to see flowers, to go shopping, sometimes to combine the two things. He didn't want to visit other gardens, that would have been too disturbing to him, entering other people's houses or territory. He preferred to go to flower shops and garden centers, and he wanted Pitton to go with him. On these excursions, when Pitton was called away, where did he sit in the manor car? Did he sit in the front, beside Mr. Phillips, the other manor servant? Or did he sit alone in the back, a man apart in another way? I feel Pitton was taken along for the company and the protection his company, together with the company of Mr. Phillips, offered my landlord. Pitton couldn't have been taken along purely for his advice as a gardener, because the plants bought, which Pitton had to look after, were not always suitable. Azaleas, I remember once, unsuited to our chalk, which Pitton had to plant more or less in pots of sand. I asked him why, and he floundered, became inarticulate, until inspiration came to him and lit up his face, and he said, "Minerals." Having planted the azaleas in sand, he had then, every day until the azaleas died, to feed them with an expensive iron solution, feeding being quite an appropriate word, for these small azaleas needed to be fed with droppers, the way birds or young motherless animals might have been fed. In my third year, my third spring, there were more of these morning shouts than before. And this had to do with a change in my landlord's condition. From being very ill and almost immobile with his asthma, at about the time the Phillipses had gone to the manor to look after him and his house, my landlord was beginning slowly to recover. Some medicine or drug had been found to neutralize the paralyzing nature of his asthma, and this brought into play again the personality, or that part of it, that had survived his long withdrawal and blankness. An operation had then partially restored his sight. In this reawakening of my landlord to life and his especial world the Phillipses helped a great deal. Mr. Phillips was professional, understanding, a protector, a strong man to whom the sick man, at once employer and dependent, could entrust himself. To the strength of her husband Mrs. Phillips added tenderness and admiration for the artistic side of the employer who wrote poetry and now, in addition, with his restored sight, began to do drawings. These drawings were oddly fluent, practiced, easy, as though they had been done many times before, as though they came from a segment of that past life of my landlord's that he had just recovered, Beardsley-like drawings, of another age, with long tendril-like lines and little stippled areas emphasizing the large areas of white. Some of these drawings, in reproduction, his continuing or reawakened extravagance, he sent me by Mrs. Phillips now, in place of the old printed sheets of poetry he had sent in my first year. In his reawakening, his rebirth, my landlord met the Phillipses halfway. He was tender with them, as they reported. They were part of the life he thought he had said goodbye to. The Phillipses accordingly felt needed. Perhaps in none of their previous jobs had they been made to feel like that, and they in their turn became softer, less spiky, more secure in their positions in the manor. Their toughness was now partly explained. It was the toughness of people who wanted to be as tough as they had found the world tough, and wished to hold themselves ready for whatever fortune threw at them. The Phillipses, becoming confident in the manor, no longer strangers to the place, became happier, as happy in their way as their employer in the summer. That repeated morning shout of "Fred!" seemed to say it all. As did that glimpse of a happy Mr. Phillips, like an impresario, driving with his employer that day in the manor car, on the road below the old beeches. That mood lasted into the next summer. Pitton often had to go away on some excursion, and sometimes when he came back he had some little piece of news for me. "I've hardly done anything today. I was called away early this morning." He wasn't complaining. He liked the idea of being called away. He was recording his pleasure at the new idleness, the new closeness to his employer, and with that closeness the sudden luxury almost of his job, car rides, shopping trips, sightseeing trips, all on a workday morning. He said, "Pitton, that's how he calls me, you know, he doesn't call me Mr. Pitton." I called him Mr. Pitton. That was why he gave this explanation. "Pitton, I think we should go to Woolworth's this morning. I hear they have a good garden department." "Woolworth's?" Pitton said, amused but respectful. Imagine him in Woolworth's. Of these summer excursions of my landlord I heard second accounts from Mr. Phillips sometimes. And of some of these excursions I had even a third account. This came from Allen, a literary man from London, a distant relation of my landlord, who sometimes came now to spend a weekend at the manor, which he had known, he said, from visits as a child, beginning with the war. Allen was in his late 30s. He was a small man, as small as I was. His size was one of the things that tormented him. He told me almost as soon as we met, as though to raise the subject before I did, that at school one of the teachers, I believe, had referred to him as dwarfish. This worry about his physical appearance perhaps explained Alan's clowning, his mighty explosions of laughter, the extravagant cut and colors and shininess of the clothes he wore at parties in London, where from time to time I saw him. The gaiety of these clothes and the boisterousness of his manner contrasted with the nervousness, almost the shiftiness, of his eyes, and contrasted as well with the solitude and soberness of dress and behavior he imposed on himself when he visited the manor, where one sometimes surprised a wrinkled old lady's look on his face, before the wrinkles became the wrinkles of gaiety. Alan seemed to spend much time alone when he was at the manor. He was to be seen at odd hours wandering about the grounds, carefully dressed, and usually in country clothes, but there was no audience there for his clothes or his moods. What did he get out of these visits? He said he liked the house, the atmosphere, and he was fascinated by my landlord, whom he found very the period, as Alan said, before the deluge, antediluvian. He had heard from my landlord about the trip with Pitton to Woolworth's. When he told me this, he roared with laughter. He said that Pitton was too ashamed to enter, and had absolutely to be dragged in. Who had improved the story I had had from Pitton, the story in which Pitton had been simply amused by the trip to the garden department of Woolworth's? Was it my landlord, the reawakened recluse? Or was it Alan? Alan had no book to his name. He wrote occasional book reviews and did occasional reviews of books and films and other cultural events for the radio. His radio work was better than his printed work, his voice and speech suggesting, and transmitting, a greater intelligence and zest. Such a slight name, though, such a slight achievement for someone nearly 40, someone who had already more or less defined his personality and path and the level of his ambitions. On the radio his voice and attack and wit suggested that those few minutes in the studio were the merest interlude in a busy, complete, rounded life, a life one might envy. Listening to him, one felt that there was so much there, in the man, the sensibility, the cultivation, the mind, there was so much more that he would have said if he had had the time. That was also the impression, though to a fainter degree, that his printed work gave. The few paragraphs one read appeared to be just a shaving from a larger, more considered view of life and art and history, and even from a more considered view of the book or play being written about. But those little reviews and short radio talks and swift discussions abruptly terminated by a chairman before the news program came on. That was the sum of Alan's work, life. He did no other job. To know his name, to mention some slight thing he had done, did not, as one might have expected from someone so urbane, get an abashed dismissal from him. It encouraged him to speak of his work. He remembered all the phrases he had made, phrases that had seemed on the radio to bubble out of a natural effervescence, and sometimes fell a little flat in print. He would say, "As I said in that review of the book about Montgomery, the writer seemed to have been dropped on the head as a baby by a military man." And he would break off and roar at his own joke, just as he roared at the joke, his own, or my landlord's, about Pitton going ashamed and cringing outside the doors of Woolworth's and having to be led in firmly by the long-haired recluse. "Isn't it nice to have rich friends?" Alan said one weekend. And feeling he had said something frank and funny, he fluttered his eyelashes, and the coquettishness, quite unexpected, revealed another side of his dissatisfaction and incompleteness. Alan, speaking of rich friends, was thinking more of himself as a writer, the man with patrons and grand houses at his disposal. But we were all embraced that summer, made light-headed, by my landlord's reawakened sense of the luxurious, his reawakened extravagance, his constant wish to seize and heighten the passing moment, to arrest and elaborate on every experience. These were the manners and style, as Alan said, as though to explain his point, of before the deluge. Now, Mrs. Phillips brought to my cottage new printed drawings, a shopping basket, flowers, elegant gifts which I found difficult to acknowledge, for the man and the nature of his gifts seemed to require a matching light elegance, and I found myself in my letters to him straining for effect, trying to make myself worthy of his generosity, trying to give myself a sensibility equivalent to his own. One sunny morning, about coffee time, I saw Pitun standing outside the overgrown box-bordered enclosure at the side of the lawn, the enclosure once attached to the house that, as I had heard from Bray, had stood on the site formerly, and possibly had older, religious antecedents. The weeds in the enclosure had grown tall, stocky with fine white flowers. But Pitun had cut his annual path through the weeds to the orchard, one swath up, one swath down. The path had been cut low, revealing level, tightly knitted grass, the grass in one swath lying at a contrary angle to the grass in the other, the two swaths showing as two distinct colors, one green, one almost gray. And Pitun now, in the middle of the morning, was standing on the lawn just outside the enclosure, standing still, looking down at the grass. The overgrown box trees made an arch above the entrance to the enclosure. Pitun was framed in this wild green arch. Behind him was the two-swathed path between the tall white-flowered weeds, like a passage in a maze. He was leaning forward, looking fixedly down, legs oddly apart, as though he were standing on sloping or uneven ground. His woolen tie, winter and summer Pitun wore a tie, hung straight down, his tie didn't rest on his paunch. He reminded me of a man I had seen 13 years before, a forest Indian in a new mission settlement in the Guiana Highlands, in South America. The settlement was on the bank of a river, not one of the great continental rivers, but a narrow river of these highlands, with big boulders on the banks, and big smooth boulders, sometimes neatly cracked, in the riverbed itself. It was a Sunday morning, and the Indian was dressed as formally as Pitun was now dressed. The Indian was in blue serge trousers and a white shirt. He had gone to the Sunday morning service in the mission chapel. The settlement was in a new clearing. The stumps of felled trees still looked raw, the forest still pressed on three sides. And now, after that morning service, the Indian was on his way back to his forest village, taking the path at the edge of the clearing, just above the river, which in sunlight was the color of pale wine, and at dusk became black. Night here made for anxiety. Daylight was always reassuring. Something on the path had caught the man's attention, had alarmed him, and he had stopped to consider what he had seen, the thing that didn't belong to the path, a twig perhaps, a leaf, a flower, and perhaps hinted at a terrible danger. For the Indians here there was no such thing as natural death. There was a killer abroad always, the Kanaima, a man like any other in appearance, never known or suspected to be the killer, and he it was who eventually killed everybody. Stock still, then, the Indian on his way back from the chapel stood on the path above the river in the morning sunlight, in his blue trousers and white shirt, wondering whether, in spite of what the missionaries had told him and his fellows, the thing he had just seen on the path wasn't a sign that the Kanaima, who got everyone in the end, hadn't finally come for him. It was a narrow path between big sunken boulders. The Indian didn't make room for me when I got to him. I walked around him. He didn't look at me. It was with a similar stance and abstraction that Pitun stood outside the overgrown enclosure. But he knew he had caught my attention, and he was waiting for me to go to him. When I was almost upon him, he lifted and slowly swung his left leg so that he stood upright. A stiff, deliberate movement, it might have been a wooden leg. But the face Pitun lifted to me was alight with passion. I had never seen him so stirred. His eyes were bright, moist, staring, his nostrils were quivering. He was full of news. Bursting with news. He said, "I've been drinking champagne. He called me to his garden and gave me champagne." And more than the wine had made Pitun muzzy. It was the sunlight, the occasion, the luxury, the hour of the morning, the unexpected development of this bewildering summer, play piling upon play. If I hadn't come upon him, he would, I feel, have gone home to share his news with his wife. He said again, getting muzzier by the minute, contemplating the moment, eyes almost wild. "Champagne." I heard another version of this event about a month later from Alan. The summer was over, more or less. Alan was wandering about the grounds in a matlow outfit, like a sailor figure of one of the earliest poems my landlord had sent me, in my first summer, after the poems about Shiva and Krishna. Alan said, "He's in great antediluvian form. I hear he's been feeding Pitun pink champagne." And the idea so amused Alan that the full laugh he started on began to choke him. Recovering, he said, "Pink champagne at 10 o'clock in the morning. He told me that Pittun was absolutely slain. Absolutely slain. And I felt now that that other story, about Woolworths, hadn't been improved on by Alan, but by my landlord. He had stored up the story of Pittun and the champagne, as Pittun himself, and Pittun's wife no doubt, had stored it up. He had stored it up to tell it to visitors like Alan, people who knew and cherished his reputation as a man with a style of before the deluge. Yet the impulse that morning, the need to celebrate the moment, would have been genuine. Later would have come the ideas he had of his own romance. Later would have come his wish to make the story, to tell the tale, to spread his legend. After the long morbid withdrawal, the near death of the soul, he had revived. But what had also revived was the idea of who he was. That was shown in the disproportionately large and thickly lettered signature on his new drawings. It was even bigger than the signature on the printed poems he had sent me about Shiva and Krishna while he was still very low, pressed down into himself. The personality that had survived its illness now had a smaller area for play. It was also a smaller personality. It could play only with people like Alan. There were not many like Alan, not many who knew his, my landlord's, legend now, and Pittun. "Isn't it nice to have rich friends?" Alan had said. But that was Alan's own fantasy. That was the vision he preferred to have of the place where he came to stay. The Phillipses knew better. They knew how many things at the manor needed to be done. They knew how little could be done. The manor had been created at the zenith of imperial power and wealth, a period of high, even extravagant, middle-class domestic architecture. The extravagance of houses like the manor lay partly in the elaborateness of the modern systems, plumbing, heating, lighting, that had been built into them at the time of the building. Whatever their architectural style or whimsies, and though in certain particulars, thatched roof, use of flintstones, they might aim at local, rustic effects, houses like the manor were a little like steamships. They had been built with that confidence, not just the confidence of wealth, but also the confidence of architects and technicians in the systems they were putting in. And it was that industrial or technical confidence, the confidence which in other manifestations had created the wealth that had built the manor, that now made the manor an expensive place to look after. The manor had been built like a steamship. But like a steamship, it was liable to breakdown and obsolescence. A boiler exploded in the manor one day, another time a bit of the roof was blown off. Each accident would have cost thousands. The plumbing and drainage systems were obsolete. When late at night water was used in some quantity at the manor, and the cistern there began to fill again, the metal pipes in my cottage hummed, in the dead silence. During the day that humming noise was masked by other sounds. The metal pipes that had been buried in my cottage walls, such had been the confidence of the original builders in their materials and systems, had also built in such damp in the walls that the pipes were shadowed on the surface of the walls by lines or tracks of gray-black mold, which was like the fur a rat leaves in its nest or hiding place. 70 years and more of rain, rolling chalk and flint and mud off the downs, had clogged the drains in some places. The lawn was not the simple level ground it seemed. It concealed the ward-in drainage pipes, which were now broken underground no one knew exactly where. In the winter of the great flood a small hole, like a rabbit hole, suddenly opened in the lawn during a morning of heavy rain. The hole seemed to cave in on itself, melt into itself, and then out of that melting hole a brown torrent, at first looking only like a kind of animal activity, a mole kicking up earth very fast, gushed for half an hour. From time to time we had a visit from the agent. This was a reminder that we were not exempt from the world where others lived, that there was a practical side to affairs, earnings, accounts, a need to balance income and expenditure. It was from the Phillipses that in the beginning I first heard of these visits. In those days, before the Phillipses had become confident, they appeared to look upon these visits by the agent as inspections, and they prepared accordingly. They didn't overdo the zeal, but it was possible, from a certain amount of activity in the manor courtyard, and sometimes even from hints dropped to me about the drift of leaves against my north wall, impossible absolutely to clear. That wall was the natural resting place of beech leaves for 200 or 300 yards around. It was possible to tell that a visit from the agent was expected. But then the agent often turned out to be a very young man, a junior, someone fresh from school or college, someone who had just joined the firm and was using our estate to cut his teeth in the land agenting business. Agents here handled mile upon mile of fishing rights, beat upon beat, thousands of acres of farmland, thousands of acres of woodland. Our few acres of wasteland, virtually untilled, though a world to us, offered no land agent a challenge or even a training. And it often happened that the young men who came, moving on quickly to higher or bigger things within their firm or another firm, never came again. It was hardly worthwhile, therefore, cultivating them or even getting to know their names. And from looking upon the visits of the agent as inspections we began, or at any rate the Phillipses began, to look upon them as occasions to ask for things, repairs here, a lick of paint there. And from making ourselves spruce to attract commendations, which might be reported at a higher level somewhere far away, we sought to look as ragged as we could. After that wonderful summer of the motorcar drives and the flowers and the champagne, we began to get very ragged indeed. 3 of the beeches at the edge of the lawn were judged to be dangerous, liable to fall into the manor courtyard. And within a week they were cut down and their branches cut up and corded, some stacked in one of the outbuildings, some carted away by the tree cutters as part of their fee. So all at once, within a week, I lost some of the green shade, the green gloom by which I had felt embraced whenever I returned to the manor from any journey, however short or long. Only the yews and beeches at the front of the house separated me from the road, and though the beech trees, big as they were not really a form of sound protection, I fancied after those 3 beeches went that the road noises were louder, especially after 5, so that, for the first time here, I became aware of the end-of-day traffic. And I fancied I heard the military airplanes more clearly too. How fragile my little world was here! Just leaves and branches. Just leaves and branches created the colors and the enclosure I lived within. Remove them, a morning's work with a chainsaw, and the public road would be just there, less than 100 yards away, and all would be open and exposed. How often, with Pitton's mower, I had cut the thin, pale green, straggly grass under those beeches, going right up to the end of the lawn, next to the overgrown yews, going right up to where the ground was not grass or lawn so much as old twigs and beech mast and old, light-starved dust. It was never satisfying to use the mower there, but it was necessary, because it completed the job, gave the complete, swept, cared for effect all over, so that for a day or 2 after a grass cutting it was a pleasure for me to look at what I had done, the swaths I had created myself in rich grass and poor grass, from end to end of the lawn. Now, in the openness after the 3 beeches had been felled, grass began even in the autumn to appear on that twiggy, dusty soil. And all that winter and spring, until the grass began truly to grow again, there remained, quite literally, impressions of the felled beeches on the lawn. The tree fellers had made them fall at a particular angle, so that in the new openness, the new light around the manor courtyard, the beeches, though they had ceased to exist, seemed for half a year to cast ghostly shadows. The decision to cut the beeches was a prudent one. The gales were severer than usual in the spring, so severe that I stood in my cottage kitchen to watch, through a low window, the effect on the beeches in front and, through the glass at the top of my kitchen door, the trees at the back. It was strange, but for myself, in my cottage, I never ever feared. And I actually saw the 2 great aspens at the back of the manor garden snap, twice, a tearing off near the top and then a fierce, short snapping back lower down. So that, understanding the principle of the damage, it was a little like watching a human or animal limb break. I hadn't planted those trees, but I saw them destroyed. In the spring and summer the 3 aspens, planted perhaps 10 feet apart, had created the effect of a great green twinkling fan above the garden wall. Now 2 of the 3 aspens had been snapped like twigs and showed, but on a magnified scale, that sort of twig snap damage. And their debris lay between the water meadow and the vegetable garden wall, just beyond the briar wilderness of the old rose bed. It needed more than Pitton and his hands saw to clear the mess. I tried to help him. But even when we worked on a smallish bough, there always came a moment when the saw stuck in the wet, sappy wood and became very hot. Pitton would say, "It's tying. We'd better stop." "Tying, Mr. Pitton?" I liked the word. I had never heard it before, but it was suggestive and felt right. Pitun became embarrassed, as embarrassed as he had been when I had asked him what was in the sand that was good for the azaleas he had been asked to plant. As embarrassed as he had been when he told me my landlord had liked the peonies, rhyming with ponies, in front of my cottage, and while feeling constrained to use the affected Edwardian pronunciation of my landlord, had wished at the same time to show, without disrespect or disloyalty, that he also knew the other, more common and correct pronunciation. The fallen trees were a great obstruction now if I wanted to go on the river walk. The jagged whitewood of the aspen stumps, 15 or 20 feet high, slowly lost its rawness. With the spring and summer there were even new shoots. The planter or the designer of the garden would have carried in his or her mind's eye the fan effect the 3 trees were intended to have when the seedlings or saplings had been planted 10 feet apart. Far apart they would have seemed then, and for the next 5 years or so, but still too close together. As it turned out, the trees at the sides, as they had grown, had leaned away from the vertical. The fan effect had been seen by me. I had seen the 3 trees grow by many feet every year. I had also seen what the planter of the garden would not have cared to think about, the very second, not longer, when the 2 side trees snapped. The trees would have spanned, or been contained within, my landlord's life. He must have seen that 2 of the aspens were no longer there. He must have seen the mighty debris in the back garden. But I had no word from Mr. or Mrs. Phillips that my landlord had seen or made any comment. It seemed suitable, so ragged had we become since the autumn, that in the early summer we should have had a visit one day, in mid-morning, not from 1 but 2 men from the agents. And this time not just the standard very young men. There was one of those, but with him there was an older man, a taller, heavier man in his late 40s or early 50s. I saw the 2 men on the lawn with Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips shorter than the other 2, but much more muscular, in his zip-up windcheater. The young man in his navy blue blazer, the heavier older man from the agents in a well-worn gray suit, a country shirt, and an old-fashioned polka-dotted handkerchief stuffed into his breast pocket. They looked at the granary. They opened the garages or wagon sheds next to the granary. They opened the farmhouse and looked at that. They wandered away, down the box-hedged enclosure, and a little while later reappeared. The young man in the blazer came in to see me. The older man went on with Mr. Phillips along the lane to the manor, past the overgrown yew hedge and the new openness where once the tree beeches had cast shade. Talking about the dereliction he had seen in the back garden, the young man said, "It's a cruel thing to say, but the best thing would be to cut down all the beeches and plant afresh." It was a cruel thing to say. It would do away with the place and setting I lived in. But the young man wasn't speaking with any great conviction or concern. His eyes were quite bright with pleasure. He had been slightly oppressed by being all morning in the company of his superior, the man in the gray suit, and now, in the cottage, he, younger than he looked from a distance, was oddly skittish and playful and relaxed. Not at all agent material, I would have thought. And it turned out, very soon, that his heart wasn't in the business. His comment about the trees was just something he had said because, perhaps, he had heard it said in various circumstances by other people in the agency. As was his comment, looking at the paddock where the dairyman from the neighboring farm had kept his pony, and where the once famous old racehorse had come to die. "You could put a couple of beeves in there and fatten them up." A couple of beeves, was that really his language, his style? It wasn't, and that self-awareness or self-knowledge lay so close to the surface of his thoughts that it required only the beginning of conversation to bring it out. His father was a gamekeeper on a proper estate not far away. Through the recommendation of his father's employer he had been taken on for a trial period by the agency, and he had accepted the offer, this thin young man with the smiling, blank, unformed face, to please both his father and his father's employer. But his heart was elsewhere. He didn't know exactly where. He would have liked service life, would have dearly liked to be an officer. But some physical disability, and perhaps also some examination failure, had kept him out of that. He said, "You're never one of them." Them? Who were his them? The them he was concerned with turned out to be the other young men from the agents. At the end of the day they simply went home. There was no question of going to a pub with them, or of them, asking him home. And simply, in his skittish, restless, shallow way, he bared his personality in a few minutes. And there was almost nothing more he had to say when the big man in the gray suit came to call with Mr. Phillips. The young man in the blazer then stopped talking and continued to smile in his friendly, empty way. The big man sat down in my shabby armchair, and he seemed genuinely tired, genuinely happy to sit down, happy to sip the coffee he was offered. He tried to suggest that, without looking, he really was looking, but I didn't feel he was looking now. I felt he had seen enough already. He was puffy, a recent puffiness over a body that had once been sturdy and active. He was in his late 40s. His breathing was difficult, and his hair was thin and flat and lackluster. The polka-dotted handkerchief in his breast pocket was an odd touch of gaiety. He was not interested in me, my past, or what I did. He had ceased already to be interested in Mr. Phillips. He was already, though sitting in my armchair, far away, with himself, his solitude. What could interest such a man? What kinds of things had once pricked his curiosity or caused him surprise? Perhaps now, he gave that impression, he was a little melancholy that active life had gone by so quickly already. Perhaps he had been moved by the dereliction of what he had seen in the manor, and in the manor grounds. Perhaps it had chimed in with his own mood, reinforced that mood. He said, no doubt having been briefed by Mr. Phillips. Nice spot for writing. I said. It's nice. But I know it can't last. He said quietly. No one can be certain of anything. And the words, though so ordinary, seemed to be spoken less to me than to himself and about himself. All at once the inspection, if it had been that, was over. All three men left. They walked back to the manor along the lane between the cottage and the vegetable garden. The man in the gray suit walked heavily, carefully, making me aware of the hard lane, with chippings of stone or heavy limestone beaten into the surface, with water-carried drifts of beech mast and leaf debris in the ruts made by motor tires. They walked past the hidden garden pit and had some summers before spent a week clearing. Mr. Phillips, muscular and steady and already half-protective towards the heavy, breathless man in the gray suit on his left, and with the slender, frivolous, even slightly skipping, gamekeeper's son in his blazer on the right. About half an hour or so later, before lunch, Mrs. Phillips came to see me. She was wearing her blue padded cardigan or jacket that bloated her and suggested someone wearing an emergency life jacket, as in an illustration in an airline card about emergency exits, and what to do when the aircraft came down in water. The dark skin below her eyes, the darkness and pouches of her nerves, had lost some of its gathers and fussy lines, had lost even some of its darkness. Though she still had the manner of an invalid, someone who needed to be looked after, she had long ago begun to heal. Her hair had gone thin, had begun to go back from her forehead, giving her the high white forehead of a lady in an Elizabethan painting. So there was in her face a mixture of coarseness and delicacy. She stood in the kitchen doorway, not coming in. Behind her, the stony lane, the abandoned cold frames, the vegetable garden wall with the tiled coping, and the blackthorns that had grown up in the past 5 years on both sides of the wall, flourishing on the other, sunny side of the wall, rising above the wall, but thin and long stalked on my side, the side I could see, growing in a poor corner and dragged up mainly by light, it seemed. Those blackthorn seedlings, the flowers and then the fruit, had worried the Phillipses. Though they had lived here, in the region, all their life, and Mr. Phillips's father had been born just a few miles away, their knowledge of country things was restricted. Far away, rising now from what more than ever had become a water-meadow wilderness, against the big southern sky which I loved looking at, there was the damaged, the mutilated, aspen fan, with the jagged torn stumps of the two side aspens clearly showing. It would be 15 or 20 years before aspen greenery such as I had known would again shade and give scale to the view. Mrs. Phillips said, "I thought I should let you know." This was her nurse's manner, which she shared with Mr. Phillips and perhaps to some extent copied from him. The other side of this manner, with Mr. Phillips, was his authority, his power, his irritability. With Mrs. Phillips it was her invalid's manner, the thin dark skin darkening and gathering below her eyes, the thin veins getting blue and prominent, seeming about to rupture, suggesting with the very many fussy shallow lines on her forehead infinite suffering and fragility. She said, "I thought I should let you know. I know you are close to him. They're letting Mr. Pitton go. The Mr. was for my sake, that was how I called him and referred to him. She and Mr. Phillips called him Fred. Of course," she said a little more jauntily, "it's been coming for some time." And that was true, though I had never wanted to face the facts or to inquire too carefully into them, half wishing to believe in magic, in things going on as I had found them, believing, like Alan, to some extent, in the great wealth of my landlord and the ability of the people who looked after his affairs to perform great financial feats. But I knew that Pitton and his house were costing money, and the Phillipses were costing money, and the manor itself was very expensive to maintain, even in the way it was. And I could see that the estate, more a nature reserve than workable land, provided little revenue. The great inflation of the mid-70s would have cut cruelly into whatever income my landlord had. And the manor required too much attention. It wasn't a place that could simply be let go. It wasn't like my cottage. Its scale was more than human, it exaggerated human needs. People had to be trained to use buildings like the manor, and that was why, like the ancient Roman villa at Chedworth in Gloucestershire, these buildings were perishable. People could easily do without them. When the boiler exploded at the manor, and the ceramic, or concrete, or asbestos casing of the tall metal chimney against one wall had shattered into 1,000 jagged fragments all over the manor courtyard, I heard, either from the Phillipses or from Michael Allen, the young central heating man, who came with his van and spent many days in the courtyard, that the annual heating costs at the manor were £4,000 to £5,000. That might have been an exaggeration. Men like Michael Allen, entering rich houses for the first time because of their skills and trades, might have liked to exaggerate the importance of their county or gentry clients. Still, £5,000 as a heating bill, it showed how unstable prices, and our world, had become. In 1857, in Madame Bovary, Flaubert could write of the peddler's 6% interest charge as extortionate, bloodletting. Now we lived easily with that kind of charge. In 1955, when I was very young and new to London and trying to write, I wanted nothing more than £500 a year, and more modest than Virginia Woolf 30 years before, I would have undertaken to pay for my own rented room out of those £500. In 1962, at a lunch in a London club with a humorous writer and a cartoonist, I put my needs, the two other men had asked, at £2,000 a year. I had moved up from the rented room to the rented, self-contained flat. This figure had scandalized my fellow lunchers, older men, as far too low. And indeed, just 3 years later, when I had bought a house and taken on a mortgage, I would have considered £5,000 a year as just about fair. Now that was a figure that could be talked about as a heating charge. Not many fortunes would have been able to stand that kind of expense, one among many, and my landlord had retired from the world in 1949 or 1950, some years before I had thought £500 a year enough for my needs. I watched for Pitton. He had the knack, sometimes it seemed, in spite of the steadiness and gravity of his movements, like a little game he played with himself, of reaching the white gate at the end of the lawn more or less on the stroke of 1 o'clock. He would appear on the lawn in front of my cottage, his morning's work done, 4 or 5 minutes before the hour. He would do what he had to do in the garden shed, put away tools, reassume formal clothes, if that was necessary, for the short walk along the public road to his house, lock up the shed, and then, adjusting his pace to the time in hand, start on the walk to the gate. Sometimes he would enter the lawn from the vegetable garden, through an old wooden gate, over-specified, pulled out of true now by its own sturdiness and weight, in the garden wall. Sometimes, coming out of the summer bush as clean as a cat, he walked up from the overgrown orchard through the overgrown box-hedged enclosure. This morning he came out of the box-hedged enclosure. He had only in the last week cut his first summer path through the tall weeds there, one swath up, one swath down. He was not wearing his plastic raincoat, or his Wellingtons. He was quite formally dressed, without a jacket, but with a country shirt and his woolen tie. He didn't have to change. What he had to do in the garden shed didn't take long. His walk to the gate was his very slow, arm-dangling walk. Not the way he walked when he pushed open the gate at 9 in the morning, not the way he walked when he worked. This very slow walk was the way Pitton walked when his work was over, when his time had become his own again. And there was nothing in his walk now that hinted at the end of a routine, nothing in his pre-lunch ritual that suggested an agitated man, a man in possession of the news Mrs. Phillips had given me half an hour before. At 2 o'clock he was back. He unlatched the white gate that separated the short, dark, yew-hung lane from the open manor lawn, latched it behind him, and his walk, though unhurried, suggested a man who was at work again. I thought that there had been a mistake, that Mrs. Phillips had misheard, or had passed on to me as a decision something that had been only an idea, something that had perhaps been discussed and dropped. Pitton was so untroubled, I thought he knew better than Mrs. Phillips. An hour and a half later, after my walk on the downs, past Jack's cottage, up between the barrows to the view of Stonehenge, an hour and a half later, coming back to the grounds, I heard the shout of "Fred!" from Mr. Phillips, shouting to Pitton from the manor, shouting to Pitton somewhere in the back garden. There was no reply. This was normal. And then at 5 there was the ritual of Pitton's departure, locking up the garden shed, and expressing in his very slow walk to the front gate the end of the day's labors. But he didn't appear at the gate at 9 the next morning. He didn't appear at 9:30 or at 10. It was later, in the middle of the morning, just before 11, that I saw him. And he was banging imperiously at my kitchen door, the only door I used, the door that faced the abandoned cold frames, the heavy timber-framed glass cover stacked up against the high garden wall, the nettles growing tall behind and between the glass, and, over the wall, some distance away, near the river willows, the tall middle aspen and the mangled but already sprouting stumps of the other two. The foolish pride he had displayed when I had seen him in his house and complimented him on his hi-fi equipment, the pretense that he had a rich source of money quite separate from his gardener's wages, the passion, the staring, enlarged eyes, the quivering nostrils on the pink champagne morning when he had stood awkwardly bent, the tie dangling from his neck, in front of the overgrown box trees and waited for me to come to him. All of that, the folly, the pride, the wildness, the passion, was in his face. But instead of the surprise of champagne there was the bewilderment of anger, an anger that seemed to have taken him to a depth of feeling for which he was not prepared, anger that seemed to have taken him close to madness. He said, "You heard? You heard?" He was wearing no tie. The shirt of the day before, but no tie. I saw him without a tie only on Sundays sometimes, in the summer, when the ice cream van passed before lunch and tinkled its chimes, and we both went out to buy ice cream. He wanted someone to witness and share his outrage. He could not bear to be with himself. But he had no gift of words, had never had. All the passion came out in his face. It was like the champagne surprise, but twisted, and taken several notches higher, and in his abrupt movements. I opened the door wide for him to come inside. But he, as though recognizing that he had nothing more to say, stayed outside. Abruptly he turned away and walked fast and jerkily, as though with some sudden clear purpose, down the lane between my cottage and the yew hedge and the forester's hut on one side and the half-cottage against the garden wall on the other side, the half-cottage in which I stored coal and wood and other things. A little way beyond this half-cottage, and how well, from using the lawn-mower in that neglected corner, I knew the uneven ground, partly built up from wood ash, and knew the tufts of rough grass, there was the tall gate in the vegetable garden wall. This was Pitton's gate. It was chained and padlocked every evening, and Pitton had the key. The gate, as old as the manor, had a heavy timber frame, with solid boards in its lower half and vertical iron bars in its upper half. It had been pulled out of true by its own weight and sturdiness. Whenever Pitton opened the gate he had to lift it slightly, and the part of the vertical iron bar which he had held in this strong lifting way 4 or 5 or 6 times a working day was smoother and much darker than the rest of the iron, which was rusted and rough and dry. To this gate Pitton went, walking fast, jerkily. His own gate, opening into his own territory. But he didn't have the key. That was in the garden shed. He crossed the lawn in his new hurried way to the garden shed built onto the side of the farmhouse. Beside the green-painted, faded door there was an old climbing rose. Piton pruned it each year. It produced only a few roses, but they were all big, cabbagey things, pale pink. Piton had the key to the garden shed on him. It was attached to a chain. The chain was fixed to a loop in his waistband. He pushed the green door open. The shed was dark inside. He forgot about the key to the garden gate. He left the shed door wide open and walked across the lawn, that part which still bore the impression, like ghostly shadows, of the 3 felled beeches, to the openness of the manor courtyard. The wide open door of the garden shed, left just like that, was unlike Piton. A while later he walked past my cottage again to the heavy gate in the garden wall. Forgetting again that he didn't have the key to the padlock, that he had gone for it to the garden shed and got distracted. He was disorientated, his frenzy expressed in these brisk, jerky little journeys, half yielding to his old routine, his wish to look after his garden, to do the jobs he had planned to do that morning, and then awaking afresh to his loss. Like an ant whose nest had just been smashed, he moved about hither and thither. At some stage he closed the door of the garden shed, and then he went away, but not by the white gate. At lunchtime Mrs. Phillips came to see me. She had a reproving hospital manner, she said, as though speaking to one patient about another who had behaved badly. Your Mr. Piton was quite another person this morning. He came and sounded off about everything under the sun, accusing us of everything he could think of, as though we had anything to do with anything. He knew very well what was going to happen. He knew everything yesterday. I don't know why he pretended not to know. It was just pretense, you know. He didn't say a thing, not in the morning, not at lunchtime, not when he had his tea with us. That was typical Piton. She spoke as though Piton's refusal the previous day to acknowledge his notice or his news, when she would have been waiting for his reaction, was wicked, and deserved the punishment it got. She spoke as though this wickedness of Piton's made everything explicable, absolved us all of the need to feel concerned for Piton and frightened for ourselves. And it was strange, Piton's silence of the previous day. Had he not understood? Had he not taken in what had been said to him? Had he simply not listened? Had the words of the man in the gray suit been roundabout? Had the news been too shocking for Piton to believe it? Or was it his own form of magic? I remembered how when Jack had fallen ill and his garden had grown wild, and the chimney was smoking in the summer, and Jack was in his bedroom trying to get warm, trying to unfreeze the blocks of ice that his lungs must have felt like, I remembered how Jack's wife had denied that anything was wrong with the garden, and her manner had even suggested that I had said something discourteous and wrong. So quite suddenly, from one day to the next, part of the routine of the manor I had grown into, part of my new life and comfort, my private, living book of hours, was snapped. I never saw Piton unlatching the wide white gate at the end of the lawn at 9 again, or walking back to it at 1 and then at 5 with the special slow step of a man who had done his morning's and then his day's labor. Were there personal things he had left behind in the garden shed, Wellingtons, a plastic raincoat, a jacket? Did he come back for these things later, or did he abandon them, with the garden shed key? The key he had carried in that intimate way, on a chain that ran from a loop in his waistband to his right trouser pocket. That key he had to give up to Mr. Phillips. And thereafter at odd hours the washed-out green-painted garden shed door, beside the thick-stalked rose bush, now almost a small tree, that Piton had pruned year by year, thereafter for long periods during the day that door remained open, Piton's shed exposed, Piton's territory no longer Piton's, either shed, nor key, nor tools, nor the heavy, tilting gate to the vegetable garden. That open garden shed door, which Piton had been so particular to keep closed, I could see it from the window of my room, and it was unsettling. I wished to close it. It was like the wish to straighten a mirror or picture hanging crooked on a wall. That open door, together with other changes, it was as though the man concerned had died in some unsanctified way, and everything that had been his could now be treated without ceremony. When Jack, over the hill, had fallen ill, his flower and fruit garden had grown wild, and his vegetable garden, created in the waste ground between the farmyard metal dump below the beaches and the beginning of the cultivated down, had gone to seed. Pitton's vegetable garden didn't go to seed. It was tended through the summer, and its produce was gathered in. Many strangers now came to the manor grounds, to do irregularly, in bits and pieces, the job that Pitton had done with unhurried system, the job around which he had built his mornings and his afternoons, his week, his year, marking the end of each stage with his own kind of ritual. This fragmentation of his job was like a further downgrading of the man, downgrading him now, and downgrading all he had done and been in the past, all his careful routine. Some of the strangers in the manor were casual workers, paid by the hour or the day and obtained by the Phillipses from I don't know where, perhaps from the places Mr. Phillips had worked in before. Some were friends. One, who soon ceased to be a stranger, was Mr. Phillips's widowed father. He was much smaller than his son, and slighter. Physically he was of another generation, another world. One could see in him the physique of agricultural workers in old photographs. Since the death of his wife, Mr. Phillips's mother, the old man had been solitary. This opening up of the manor grounds to him, where he had been only an occasional visitor on Saturday afternoons, and the opportunity for a little light work, was a blessing to the old man. He lived much in the past, and liked to talk of the past. He was sociable. Solitude was not something he had chosen. It was like old age, something he had had to learn to live with. He had been born not far away and had lived all his life in the county. He told me at our first meeting, just outside my kitchen door, that he had started life as a carrier's boy, the carrier for whom he worked making a living by carrying goods and parcels for people living along the 8 miles between Amesbury and Salisbury. The old man spoke of this job, his first, as of something indescribably rich and rewarding, an enchantment. He dressed neatly, in jacket and tie, like Pitton, and unlike his son, who preferred more casual and sporty clothes. And again unlike his son, the old man wore very pale colors. It was as though the chalk of the downs by which he had been surrounded all his life had affected his taste in colors, had made him see tints where another person might have seen something neutral. The old man often came now simply to walk about the grounds, and he dressed for these walks in the manor bush as though for an urban promenade. In this he was like Pitton, in my earliest memory of Pitton. Sometimes, with the suit or the sports jacket and tie, the old man also walked with a staff, of a sort I had never seen before, shoulder-high, with a prong or fork at the top in which the thumb was rested, the carrier's boy now walking freely, privileged as the father of his son, walking with his old-fashioned staff in the overgrown grounds of a big house that was being built while he was a carrier's boy. Did the old man make the connection? The summer jobs were done. The fallen aspens, about whose wide, tangled spread of broken branches grass and weeds had grown tall and dark, a separate area of vegetation. The fallen aspens were cut up with a chain saw and the cut logs piled up in the back garden. Grass now grew tall around the log piles, just as grass and the plants they attracted grew into a bush around the trunk fragments that were too big to cut up and stayed more or less where they had fallen, soon looking old, like old debris, suggesting the further advance onto the back lawn of the water meadow wilderness. The grass of that lawn was cut. The area of the aspen fall never recovered, never returned to grass, and was abandoned to weeds and marsh growth, and the lawn in front of my cottage was cut. And the vegetable garden was looked after. This garden was hidden from my cottage by a high wall. Beyond the half-cottage that was my outbuilding there was, set in this wall, the heavy gate with the metal bars. This gate hung unevenly, but Pitton had developed the knack of closing it. His successors didn't have this knack. The gate, unlatched, dragged more and more and was eventually left open. Pitton's garden, the scene of his secret labors, was now quite exposed. Astonishing now, when I went in to look, astonishing as always, the different sense of space, the openness on the other side of the garden wall. The wall on that side was warm, sun-bleached. Old fruit trees had been trained and pinned against it. The wall on my side was damp, always in shadow, only summer weeds growing in the poor soil at its base. The wall that I saw from my cottage was a northern wall. The wall on the other side was Mediterranean, part of the grandeur of the original walled garden design, with its paths, its nursery beds, its vegetable areas, its formal orchard. Pitun had been able to keep only part of the garden going, but he had honored its formality, design, and dignity. Now, after the bonanza of his vegetable garden, his successors were creating only an allotment. A cycle in the life of the manor had come to an end. There might one day be the beginning of a new cycle. But for the moment, or for some years ahead, the great walled garden, calling for the labor of many hands, had returned to a modest human scale, had become the setting for a small allotment. The wide white gate at the end of the lawn, the gate that had been Pitton's gate, was padlocked, for security. And since the estates along the river were so little protected, so open, and the area now attracted many communities of dropouts and vagrants, a new tide of idleness washing back and forth over the empty spaces of southwestern England, for greater security a mass of cut branches, rapidly going brown and dry and dead, was piled up against the gate. I had replaced the idea of decay, the idea of the ideal which can be the cause of so much grief, by the idea of flux. But now, in spite of myself, the associations of the manor altered for me. I saw Pitton's hand in many places, in their refuge, in the vast leaf grave he and I, working together on some afternoons, had gathered for compost, now no longer needed, in that open garden shed door, and in the heavy door in the garden wall that could no longer close. Yet I also knew that what had caused me delight, when I first came to the manor, would have caused grief to someone who had been there before me, just as what caused me grief now spoke of pure pleasure to old Mr. Phillips, with his suit and his staff, happy in the wild grounds and the small allotment. The memories of Pitton, those lingering signs of his work to which the man himself would now never add, were like the memories of a man who had died. And yet he was still with us, still living in his improved agricultural cottage next to Bray. It was because of that cottage, the cottage that went with his job, that he had to go. The cottage had become valuable, sturdily built, not period in the accepted way but old enough and genuine enough in style to be interesting, and of manageable size. It was worth many thousands, 100 times the 200 or 300 pounds that Bray's father had paid for his cottage, and the estate needed the money. But Pitton didn't believe this. I met him one Saturday morning in Salisbury. He was at his most country gentleman in appearance, the suit, the shirt, the shoes, the hat, the carefully studied outfit which consumed his money. Pitton's Salisbury hat. So stylish, so elegant and gentlemanly the gesture with which he half lifted it off his head in greeting. The imitation was now so old, the gesture so habitual, that perhaps no idea of style attached to it in Pitton's mind any longer. The face the uplifted hat revealed ran counter to the stylishness of the gesture. It was still the face of shock he had shown me when I had opened the kitchen door in answer to his imperious, angry knocking. Still that expression on his face, as though our meeting, which by chance took place in a pedestrian shopping street not far from the shop where Pitton bought his clothes, and where clothes like Pitton's could be seen in the window still, as though our meeting revived all the twisted emotions in him that could find no resolution or outlet in words. He had been told, he said, that the estate wanted his house in order to sell it. But he didn't believe that story. Who would want to buy a house next to Bray? It was an agricultural cottage, a tied cottage, something for a gardener, something that no one had particularly taken care of. And just as when I had gone to his house that Christmas time he had suggested that he had a source of income other than his gardener's wages, so now when he spoke of the house where he had lived for 25 years and more, it was to suggest that if it had been another kind of house he would have looked after it differently, and it was almost as if he were suggesting that his real house was somewhere else. Yet he didn't want to leave his agricultural cottage. And though many months had passed since he had stopped working at the manor, he wasn't really trying to find another job. It was as though he had begun to feel that if he didn't start looking for another job he mightn't after all have to find another job. He was confused, pulled in many directions, helpless. He seemed to be proving the point made by Mrs. Phillips. She had been continuing to look for some explanation of Pitton's dismissal that would make it easier for everyone to bear, and she had settled on the idea that in his last year at the manor Pitton had gone very strange, that he had been finally undermined by the solitude of his labor, a pretense of work, a kind of half-idling, in the wilderness, and that he had gone to pieces. In her previous job, Mrs. Phillips said she had seen any number of people who had gone to pieces. It wasn't only people you read about in the newspapers who went to pieces. I had thought that Mrs. Phillips was straining too hard to find an explanation. But then, meeting Pitton at the bus stop in the valley and meeting him sometimes in Salisbury, and talking about his problems, which he kept on insisting were insoluble, I thought it was possible that Mrs. Phillips was responding to the odd mixture in his personality of passion and civility and affectation and pride and independence. He didn't want to be a gardener again, he told me. He could do the job at the manor, but he couldn't do it anywhere else or for anybody else. It was too undignified. Nor did he want a town job. The country gentleman in him, or rather the free country laborer in him, feared the anonymity, the nothingness of the town worker. I would meet Pitton at the bus stop in the valley. We would talk then until the bus came. We never talked on the bus. We sat on different seats. We also continued to meet in Salisbury, and sometimes we met in the village on the public road when I was coming back from my walk over the downs. Our talks were circular. He would put ideas to me about what he might do. I would encourage him, and then he would reject my encouragement, returning to the idea of the grudge against him. Pitton's difficulty, as I understood when I put myself in his place, and examined myself and my own fears, was that he had lost touch with the idea of work. In fact, after the manor, the freedom there, the routine he had created, the calm he had established for himself, his relationship with the seasons, the year, time itself, what he feared was not work but employment, and perhaps not employment so much as the idea of the employer. In the end, quietly, ashamedly, he took a job. He drove a laundry van. I knew about it only when I saw him driving the van, the laundry leather money bag added to his country gentleman clothes and slung over his shoulder and chest like a bandolier. And in the end he left his cottage and was given a council flat in the town, on the old London coach road. It could not have been pleasant for him in the cottage towards the end, when he had been under pressure to leave, to release the property and the capital it represented to the estate. I expected that he would have been happy at having found another place to live, and quite a reasonable one. But with the passion and twisted emotions that had now become permanent with him, he complained. The flat was shabby. In what way? It hadn't been decorated. They expected him to do his own decorating. That was the way he was being treated. It was always hard, so convincing was Pitton's manner, to understand that he was an obedient soul, the father of an obedient soldier, that, with all his passion, servility, or dependence, ran deep in his nature. Bray said, "So our friend has moved out." I was sitting beside him in his car, and he spoke out of the corner of his mouth, the corner that was on my side. Bray said, "An arrogant man." Below his driver's cap, Bray's eyes, at once concentrating on the road and expressing an inward pleasure, were like slits, sloping sharply down to the sides of his face. And then, speaking of the Manor family as though they were all still there, as though the Manor organization of which his father had formed part still existed, Bray said, "They're a funny family." There was tribute in his words and also pride. He reached for a book on the shelf below the dashboard and passed it to me, with the semi-abstraction of a man concentrating on the road and also with the clumsiness of a man not used to handling books. He said mysteriously, "Have a look at this when you get home." As though the book, the mysterious object, would explain much, as though the book would free him, Bray, of the need to say more. The book was by my landlord. It was nearly 50 years old, something from the 1920s. It was a short story in verse, with many illustrations. The paper was good, the book was expensively bound in cloth, and though it carried the name of a reputable London publisher of the period, it was clear that the production of such a slight work in this lavish way had been subsidized or paid for by the author. The story was simple. A young woman gets tired of the English social round, many opportunities there for drawings of the costumes of the 1920s. She decides to become a missionary in Africa. Goodbyes are said. The lovers who are left behind pine in different ways. A ship, the ocean, the African coast, a forest river. The young missionary is captured by Africans, natives. She has fantasies of sexual assault by the African chief to whose compound she is taken, fantasies as well of the harem and of black eunuchs. Instead, she is cooked in a cannibal pot and eaten, and all that remains of her, all that one of her London lovers finds, is a 20s costume draped on a wooden cross, like a scarecrow. This was the joke knowledge of the world the young boy of 18 had arrived at. This was the knowledge, which would have appeared like sophistication, that had been fed by the manor and the grounds. And perhaps later knowledge had not gone beyond the joke. Outside England and Europe, a fantasy Africa, a fantasy Peru or India or Malaya. And perhaps passion too had never gone beyond the titillation of the Beardsley-like drawings of this book. And that was the most amazing thing about the book Bray had preserved and cherished, the drawings. They were in the very style of the drawings which Mrs. Phillips had brought over as gifts from my landlord during the previous summer, of the shopping expeditions and the champagne. He had struck his form and won admiration for his style at an early age, had early arrived at his idea of who he was, his worth and his sensibility, and he had stalled there. Perhaps he had stalled in what might be considered a state of perfection. But that perfection, that absence of restlessness and creative abrasion, that view from his back windows of a complete, untouched, untroubled world, had turned to morbidity, a death of the soul. That morbidity had been like a long sleep. Then he had miraculously awakened, and he had found his world still about him. He knew that the spaciousness of earlier days had gone. But he was prepared, as he had always been prepared, to live with what he found. That was how, projecting myself onto him, I read him. He liked ivy. When the trees in his garden collapsed, he did not complain. He had enjoyed the ivy for many years, and now he would have to content himself with other things. So it was with people. When their time came, it came. He had made no comment, from what I heard from the Phillipses, about the fall of the aspens, which he must have seen for 50 years at least. So, understanding now that there was no longer a gardener, he never, from what the Phillipses said, asked for Pitton, with whom the previous summer he had played and about whom he had made up his stories, to tell to the people remaining to him, like Alan. Like a child of 2 or 3 who might play every day with its grandmother, but then, should that grandmother suddenly die, might never ask after her. I saw Pitton driving his laundry van sometimes. Hard to recognize in him the man whose routine, whose appearance at the white gate, had been part of the new life and comfort and healing I had found in the valley. Sometimes we met on a Saturday in Salisbury. Once he came up behind me and called me by my name. Strange behavior, from a buttoned-up, wordless man. But I had known him in his glory. I had helped in the grand garden of the manor, helped with the grass, the dead beech leaves. And I had called him Mr. Pitton. He grew shabbier. Fragments of his country gentleman clothes survived on him, in other combinations, but his style changed. The laundryman who did the valley round and knew Pitton said of him, but gently and understandingly, "He's a little grumpy." But then Pitton changed. The valley laundryman, tolerant, as content with the rhythm of his weekly round, the rhythm of his year, his annual 2-week holidays, as content with the passing of time as Pitton had once been. The valley laundryman understood this change in Pitton, too, and said of Pitton's improving behavior, his lessening grumpiness, "You'd get used to it." There was more to it than that. Pitton, in this last decade of active life, grew out of what he had been. He got to know more people, at work and on the council estate where he lived. Where he had feared anonymity, he found community and a little strength. He saw his former life as from a distance. He had always sought, in his clothes, his pride in his wife's looks, his odd poor man's pretense about the other source of income, to maintain this distance from what he was. Now there was no need. Gradually he stopped acknowledging me from the laundry van. One day in Salisbury, in that pedestrian shopping street where he had tried to fill me with his own panic, one day he saw me. And then, the new man, he didn't see me.